She was the most photographed woman in the world. For 70 years, she stood at the center of every ceremony, every crisis, every moment of national grief and national triumph. And she never flinched, not once. The cameras always found the same face. Composed, unreadable, a slight tightening around the eyes when something displeased her, a smile that arrived on schedule and departed the same way. The world looked at that face and called it dignity. They called it duty. They called it the weight of the crown, carried with grace that ordinary people could only marvel at from a distance. But distance was the operative word, because the people who didn't watch from a distance, the people who stood close enough to hear her breathe, who carried her correspondence and arranged her schedule and stood outside her door waiting to be summoned, those people called it something else entirely. They used words that the royal press machine spent decades scrubbing from the record. Words like cold, words like cutting, words like... And this came from more than one member of staff who served her across multiple decades. Terrifying, in a way that you could never quite explain to someone who hadn't felt it themselves. This is not a story about the Queen the world was shown. This is a story about the Queen that her staff knew. And the two were not the same woman. There is a particular kind of cruelty that never raises its voice. It doesn't need to. It operates through silence, through the deliberate withdrawal of warmth, through a look held a fraction of a second too long, through a comment delivered in a tone so level and so precise that the person receiving it doesn't realize until hours later, sometimes days later, exactly how thoroughly they have been diminished. Queen Elizabeth II was a master of this. Not because she was malicious in the way that tabloids sometimes painted members of her family. Not because she took pleasure in the suffering of others in any obvious or theatrical sense, but because she had been trained, from before she could fully understand what training meant, to keep every human being at exactly the arm's length that the institution required. And somewhere along the way, that training stopped being something she did and became something she simply was. The people who worked for her learned this the hard way. A footman who joined the royal household in the 1980s described his first year of service as a process of gradual disorientation. He had expected formality, he had expected protocol. What he had not expected was the specific quality of her attention, the way she could look at a member of staff and somehow communicate, without saying a single word, that they were visible only in the most functional sense, that they existed in her field of perception as furniture existed, present, necessary, entirely interchangeable. He said that after 6 months he stopped expecting acknowledgment for anything he did correctly. He learned to measure success not by praise. Praise, he quickly understood, was not something that flowed downward from her, but by the absence of displeasure. If she said nothing, you had done well. If her eyes moved to you and then away again without any change in expression, you had done well. The goal was invisibility. The goal was to function so perfectly that you ceased, for all practical purposes, to exist. He stayed for 11 years. Before diving deeper on that, consider subscribing our channel and push the bell icon so you get all the updates about our channel. Asked why, he paused for a long time before answering. And then he said something that other members of staff, when interviewed separately across different decades, would echo in almost identical language. He said, "You kept hoping that one day she would see you. Really see you. Not as a function, not as a uniform, but as a person. And that hope, the hope that today might be the day, that hope kept you there long after every reasonable instinct told you to leave. She never did. Not once in 11 years did she see him. This is how she kept people. Not through warmth, but through the strategic, perhaps unconscious, perhaps entirely calculated withdrawal of it. The warmth was always just out of reach. The approval was always conditional on a standard that was never fully articulated. And so the people around her kept performing, kept striving, kept standing a little straighter, and arriving a little earlier, and doing their jobs with a precision that bordered on desperation, because the alternative was to accept that the warmth was never coming, and most of them were not psychologically equipped to accept that. The palace understood this dynamic. It had been running on this dynamic for centuries, but what made Elizabeth's version of it particularly potent, what distinguished her from the monarchs who had come before and the family members who surrounded her, was the total absence of visible effort. With some members of the royal family, staff could see the performance. They could see the moment when the switch was flipped, when the public face was assembled and the private face was set aside. With Elizabeth, there was no switch. There was no visible seam between the public woman and the private one. She was the same in front of the cameras as she was in the corridor at 6 in the morning. And that sameness, that absolute unrelenting consistency of affect, was more unsettling than any obvious performance would have been, because it meant that the composed, unreachable face the world saw was not a mask. It was just her face. A lady-in-waiting who served for nearly 2 decades described the experience of accompanying the Queen on a private visit, no cameras, no public, no ceremonial function of any kind, and being struck, almost physically struck, by the realization that nothing changed. The posture was the same. The measured quality of her speech was the same. The way her eyes processed a room, systematically, without lingering on any single element too long, was the same. There was no version of her that relaxed. There was no version of her that allowed herself, even in the company of a woman who had served her loyally for nearly 20 years, to simply be a person in a room. The lady-in-waiting said it was the loneliest thing she had ever witnessed. She also said she didn't think the Queen knew it, and that was the thing that stayed with the people who served Elizabeth long after they had left the palace and returned to lives that made ordinary demands of them, ordinary demands like being seen, like being acknowledged as having feelings that mattered, like receiving the basic human currency of recognition that most people dispensed without thinking about it. What stayed with them was not anger, exactly. Most of them were careful to say it wasn't anger. What stayed with them was something more complicated, something that had no clean name, a kind of grief, maybe? The grief of having stood so close to a person for so long and having never, not once, been allowed past the surface. She was cold. She was calculating in the way that all truly exceptional political survivors are calculating, instinctively, structurally, as a matter of architecture, rather than conscious scheming, and she was quietly, devastatingly cruel in the way that only people with absolute power and absolute composure can be cruel, not through action, but through the precise withholding of the things that the people around her needed most, and the staff endured it. Because what else do you do when the most powerful woman in the country has decided, without malice, without even awareness, that you do not quite qualify as fully human in her presence? You endure it. You stand a little straighter, you hope, and you do not speak about it, not while she is alive, not while the institution that she embodied retains its grip on the national imagination, not while the consequences of speaking are still too large and too certain to risk. But some of them spoke anyway. And this is what they said. To understand what Elizabeth became, you have to understand what Elizabeth was made from, because nobody arrives at that particular quality of coldness fully formed. It is not a personality trait that emerges in childhood the way shyness does, or curiosity, or a quick temper. It is built, it is constructed, layer by careful layer, by circumstances and institutions, and the specific demands of a life that most human beings will never be asked to live. And in Elizabeth's case, the construction began earlier than most people realize, earlier than her coronation, earlier than her father's death, earlier even than the abdication crisis that reshaped her family and her future when she was still a 10-year-old girl trying to make sense of a world that had just shifted permanently beneath her feet. It began, most of the people who knew her well would eventually agree, with her mother. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, is remembered by history in a particular way. The nation's grandmother. The wartime queen who refused to leave London during the Blitz. The small, round, relentlessly cheerful woman in the pastel coats who waved from balconies well into her 90s and made the entire country feel, somehow, that everything was going to be all right. That is the version that survived. That is the version that the palace curated and the press amplified and the public consumed with an appetite that never seemed to diminish. But the people who worked inside the palace, and more significantly, the people who watched the Queen Mother raise her daughters, described something considerably more complicated. They described a woman who was, in private, a study in controlled contradictions, warm in the way that a theatrical performance is warm, generous with charm, extravagant with affection when affection served a purpose, capable of making any individual she focused her attention on feel, for the duration of that focus, uniquely special and uniquely seen. But that warmth had a quality to it that the more perceptive observers noticed and struggled to articulate. It was warmth without depth. It was warmth as instrument, and when the instrument was no longer needed, the warmth was withdrawn with a speed and a completeness that left people blinking, trying to understand what had changed. Her elder daughter watched this. She watched it for years, and she learned from it, not consciously, not as a lesson deliberately absorbed and filed away, but in the way that children always learn from their parents, which is in the bones, before language, before awareness, before the capacity for critical distance. What Elizabeth learned was this: warmth is something you dispense strategically, and the dispensing of it is entirely within your control. But there was a second teacher, more systematic, and in some ways more consequential than her mother. Her second teacher was the institution itself. The monarchy, as Elizabeth encountered it in childhood, was not a gentle thing. It was not interested in the psychological welfare of the people it produced. It was interested in one thing only, and that thing was continuity, the survival of the institution across time, across crisis, across the particular human tendency to feel things in ways that could compromise function. The monarchy needed people who could perform under any circumstances: grief, scandal, personal catastrophe, public humiliation, and perform without visible seam. And the training it administered to achieve this was, by any reasonable modern standard, brutal. Elizabeth began formal public duties earlier than almost any royal before her. She was presented, assessed, corrected, presented again. The feedback she received was almost entirely negative in its structure. Not "you did this well," but "you must do better here, you must not show that, you must not let them see this." The language of royal training was the language of suppression. Suppress the flinch. Suppress the smile that comes too easily. Suppress the tears. Suppress the irritation. Suppress above all the impulse to react to anything in any way that was not controlled and pre-approved and entirely in keeping with the dignity that the institution required of her. She was extraordinarily good at it. Better, several of her tutors and early attendants noted with a mixture of admiration and something approaching unease than anyone had expected. There was a child who took to suppression the way some children take to music or mathematics, with a natural aptitude that suggested the skill was not entirely learned, but also in some fundamental way native. She didn't just learn to suppress her reactions, she learnt to not have them. Or more precisely, and this distinction matters enormously, she learned to have them somewhere so far below the surface that they ceased to be operationally relevant. This is not the same as not feeling. The people who knew her best were consistent on this point, and it is important. She felt things. The grief at her father's death was real, and it was deep, and it marked her in ways that she never fully articulated, but that those around her could see in the particular quality of her stillness in the years immediately following his death. The anxiety of the early coronation years was real. The strain of navigating a marriage to a man who was constitutionally unsuited to the subordinate role the monarchy required of him was real, and it took a toll that occasional flashes of private expression, a tone of voice in a meeting that lasted a second too long, a silence in response to Philip's name that had a specific weight to it, allowed the more attentive staff to perceive. She felt things. She had simply been so thoroughly trained to contain those feelings that the containment had become indistinguishable from the absence of feeling, and for the people on the receiving end of that containment, the staff, the courtiers, the family members who needed something from her that she was structurally incapable of providing, the distinction made very little practical difference. Cold is cold, whether it comes from nature or from training. There was, additionally, the specific psychological formation that came from her particular position in history. Elizabeth did not expect to be queen. This is a fact so frequently repeated that it has lost much of its force. But it is worth sitting with for a moment, because its implications for her character are significant. She grew up in a world where her uncle was king, and her father was the spare, the second son, the one without the weight, the one who had the relative luxury of being royal without being singular. And in that world, young Elizabeth was simply a princess. A notable princess, certainly. A princess who would one day play a significant ceremonial role, but not this, not the weight of everything. And then, when she was 10 years old, her uncle chose a divorced American woman over the crown, and the weight fell on her father, and through her father, irrevocably, permanently, without any possibility of appeal, it fell on her. The people who observed her in the years immediately following the abdication described a change. Not a dramatic change, not the kind of change you could point to in a single moment and say, there, that is where she became someone different, but a gradual, observable shift in the quality of her attention. She became more watchful. She became more careful. The spontaneity that attendants and family friends remembered from her early childhood, the ease, the laughter that came quickly, the physical expressiveness that young children have before they learn to monitor themselves, that quality began to recede, not all at once, not even mostly, but measurably. She was preparing herself. She was 10 years old, and she was preparing herself for something that she had not chosen and could not refuse and would not be allowed to put down for the rest of her life. By the time she was 15, the preparation was essentially complete. A governess who worked with her through the war years described her as already, at that age, possessed of a quality that most people do not develop until middle age at the earliest, the quality of perfect self-governance. She knew exactly what she was doing at every moment. She knew exactly what effect she was producing. She was, the governess said, entirely without the kind of unconscious self-revelation that most teenagers are helpless to prevent. You could not catch her off guard. You could not provoke a reaction she had not decided to have. It was, the governess said, impressive and slightly frightening in equal measure. Other staff members who encountered her during the war years and the years immediately following said something similar. There was a young footman who had the occasion, during a private family gathering in the late 1940s, to observe Princess Elizabeth in an unguarded moment, or what should have been an unguarded moment, what would have been an unguarded moment for anyone else. A piece of news had been delivered to her, something unexpected, something that, from the slight change in the set of her shoulders, had clearly registered as unwelcome. He watched her receive it. He watched her face process the information, and then he watched, with a fascination that he said remained with him for the rest of his life, as she simply filed it. Somewhere internal, somewhere inaccessible, her face returned to its default state within seconds. She thanked the person who had delivered the news. She turned back to the room. She was, to all appearances, exactly what she had been 30 seconds earlier. He said he had never seen anything like it. He also said that watching it had made him feel obscurely but unmistakably afraid. Not of her, exactly, of what it must cost, because nothing comes without cost. Not even, not especially, the kind of control that Elizabeth exercised over herself for 7 decades of public life. Somewhere behind that face, behind that extraordinary, unbroken composure, there was a person paying the bill. There was a person absorbing everything that the face refused to show, and the cost of that, the daily, hourly, lifelong cost of containing everything that most human beings need to release, had to go somewhere. It went into the people around her. It went into the staff who served her and the family members who needed her. and the courtiers who depended on her and received, in return for their dependence, the particular cold precision of a woman who had long ago made peace with the fact that she would give the institution everything and the people around her only what was strictly necessary for their continued function. She had not chosen this, or perhaps she had, in the only way that matters, by accepting it so completely and so early that acceptance and choice became indistinguishable. Either way, the result was the same, and the staff, who had no framework for understanding what they were dealing with, and no mechanism for addressing it and no recourse when it hurt them, endured it, as they would continue to endure it, for decades. There is a document that circulates, in various forms, among people who have worked in royal households. It is not an official document. It has no letterhead, no formal title, no institutional endorsement of any kind. It is passed along informally, mentioned in conversation, summarized over dinner, occasionally written down in the private diaries and memoirs that former staff produce years or decades after their service has ended. And what it describes, in language that varies depending on who is doing the describing, but remains consistent in its essential content, is the unwritten code of conduct that governed life inside the palace. The first rule of that code was simple: you do not speak about what you see. The second rule was an extension of the first: you do not speak about what you hear. The third rule was the one that took new staff the longest to fully internalize, because it was the most counterintuitive, the most psychologically demanding, and the most ruthlessly enforced. You do not speak about what you feel. Not to colleagues, not to family members waiting at home who wanted to know how the day had gone, not to friends who asked, with perfectly innocent curiosity, what it was really like to work inside the most famous household in the world. The answer to that question, what is it really like, was the one answer that the code absolutely forbade. You could offer surface details, you could describe the physical grandeur of the rooms, the precision of the ceremonial occasions, the logistical complexity of managing a household that operated simultaneously as a private residence, a working institution, and a global symbol. These things were safe. These things could be shared without consequence. But the interior life of the household, the emotional weather, the dynamics between people, the specific texture of what it felt like to serve a woman who regarded emotional expression as a form of institutional weakness, that was sealed. That was protected by a combination of legal obligation, professional consequence, and something more powerful than either of those things. It was protected by the particular social pressure that the palace exerted on the people inside it, a pressure so pervasive and so thoroughly internalized that most staff didn't experience it as pressure at all. They experienced it as simply how things were, as the natural order, as the way that people who understood their role behaved, and the way that people who didn't understand their role embarrassed themselves. Several former members of staff described, independently of one another, the experience of their first weeks in royal service as a process of rapid social calibration. They arrived with whatever assumptions they had brought from their previous lives, assumptions about workplace culture, about the basic reciprocity of professional relationships, about the reasonable expectation that human beings in close daily contact would develop some form of genuine connection over time, and then, one by one, those assumptions were corrected. Not through explicit instruction in most cases, not through a formal briefing or a written policy document, but through the accumulated weight of small moments, a look from a senior member of staff when a new arrival spoke too freely, a silence that lasted a beat too long after an unguarded comment, the subtle but unmistakable social withdrawal that followed any display of emotion or individuality that the code deemed excessive. They all learned, eventually. The ones who didn't learn didn't stay. A housekeeper who spent 14 years in royal service described the calibration process with a specificity that suggested she had spent considerable time thinking about it after the fact. She said that within the first month, she had identified the 3 categories into which all behavior inside the palace could be sorted. There was behavior that was invisible, meaning acceptable, meaning unremarkable, meaning it produced no reaction from anyone around her, and therefore could be safely continued. There was behavior that produced a particular quality of attention, a heightened awareness from senior staff, a slight adjustment in the social temperature of whatever room she happened to be in, which meant she was approaching a boundary and should redirect immediately. And there was behavior that produced silence. Not ordinary silence, a specific silence that she learned to recognize with physical precision, the way you learn to recognize the particular quality of air pressure that precedes a storm. That silence, she said, was the palace's primary disciplinary mechanism. And it worked. It worked because the silence came ultimately from the top, because the tone of any institution is set by the person at its center, and the person at the center of this institution had elevated silence to an art form, had made it, over 7 decades of practice, into something that could communicate entire volumes of displeasure, entire hierarchies of judgment, entire assessments of a person's worth and competence and place within the order, all without a single word being spoken, all while maintaining the composed, benign, entirely unimpeachable surface that the public saw and the cameras captured and the nation adored. Elizabeth's silences were famous inside the household, not the ordinary silences of a woman who was simply not speaking, not the comfortable silences of someone at ease in her surroundings. Her silences had a quality that people struggled to describe, but consistently attempted to. One former private secretary called them load-bearing. He explained, that they carried weight, that you could feel them pressing on you, that a silence from her in response to something you had done or said was not a neutral absence of communication, but a very specific form of communication, one that conveyed, with extraordinary precision, exactly where you stood and exactly how far you had fallen short. He said that in 15 years of service, he had developed the ability to read her silences the way a musician reads notation, that he could tell, within seconds of her not responding to something, whether the silence meant mild dissatisfaction, manageable, correctable, not a lasting mark against him, or something more serious, something that would follow him through subsequent interactions, that would alter the quality of her attention toward him for days or sometimes weeks, that would require a sustained period of flawless performance before the temperature between them returned to whatever passed in that household for normal. He said it was exhausting. He also said that he had been better at reading people, all people, not just her, by the time he left than he had been when he arrived. That the enforced attentiveness of working for a woman who communicated primarily through implication and omission had sharpened him in ways that his subsequent career had benefited from considerably. But he was careful to distinguish between the incidental professional development and the deliberate institutional cruelty of the environment that had produced it. He said, "I don't want to romanticize what it cost. It cost a great deal, and not everyone who paid it came out the other side with something to show for it. Some of them simply came out diminished. There was a young footman. Several accounts refer to a young footman, though the details vary enough that it may be multiple people or one person whose story circulated and accumulated detail in the telling, who made the error, in his 2nd year of service, of responding to a question from the Queen in a way that contained a fraction too much personality. He had answered her question correctly. The information he provided was accurate. The manner of his delivery was respectful and appropriate by any external standard, but it contained, somewhere in the phrasing, a quality of self, a small, almost imperceptible assertion of individual presence that exceeded what the code permitted. She did not respond. Not to the answer, not to him. She simply moved on, redirected her attention to the next item of business with a completeness that was, to anyone watching, perfectly natural. To him, it was annihilating, because he understood, in the way that people inside that environment quickly learn to understand, exactly what the redirection meant. He had been assessed. He had been found to have overstepped, and the penalty for overstepping was not reprimand. Reprimand would have been almost preferable, because reprimand is direct. Reprimand acknowledges you as someone worth addressing. The penalty was erasure. temporary but total. A withdrawal of the already minimal acknowledgment that was the closest thing to warmth that the environment offered. He requested a transfer within 3 months. The senior staff member who processed his request said he seemed, for someone leaving what most people on the outside would have considered a prestigious and desirable position, extraordinarily relieved. This was the hierarchy of silence that Elizabeth presided over. Not a hierarchy of rank, exactly. Rank was explicit, documented, understood by everyone in the household from the first day. This was something different. This was a hierarchy of acknowledgment, of visibility, of the degree to which your existence registered as significant to the woman at the center of everything. And the brutal, clarifying truth of that hierarchy was that almost no one registered as fully significant. Almost no one was seen in the way that human beings need to be seen. Almost everyone existed, in her field of perception, somewhere on a spectrum between necessary and invisible, and the distance between those 2 points was not as great as the people entering royal service generally imagined. The ones who thrived, and some did thrive genuinely, building careers of remarkable length and distinction inside the household, were the ones who made a particular psychological adjustment early enough that it became natural rather than effortful. The adjustment was this: they stopped wanting to be seen. They redirected the need for acknowledgement, the basic human appetite for recognition that the environment could not and would not satisfy, toward something else, toward the work itself, toward the abstract satisfaction of proximity to history, toward the quiet pride of institutional belonging that the palace offered in lieu of the personal warmth it withheld. Some of them managed it. Most of them managed it imperfectly, carrying the deficit with them through their years of service and beyond, carrying it in the form of the particular wistfulness that tended to characterize accounts from former royal staff, the quality of people describing an experience that was genuinely extraordinary and genuinely costly in equal measure, unable to fully separate the two, unable to say simply that it was worth it or simply that it wasn't, because the answer was always both. It was always, impossibly both. There is a particular kind of story that former royal staff tell when they have been away from the palace long enough to feel safe telling it, not long enough to feel entirely comfortable. That comfort, for most of them, never fully arrives, because the palace has a long memory and a longer reach than people on the outside generally appreciate, but long enough that the immediate consequences feel sufficiently distant to risk the telling. These stories share a common structure. They begin with an ordinary moment, a routine task, a standard interaction, a day that gave no particular indication of being different from any other day. And then something shifts. Something small, something that in any other workplace would be unremarkable, would be absorbed and forgotten within hours. But inside the palace, inside the specific atmospheric pressure of a household run by a woman who communicated primarily through implication and whose approval was the only currency that truly mattered, these small things had a weight that was entirely disproportionate to their apparent size, and the staff carried that weight. Long after the moment had passed, long after the Queen had moved on to the next item on her schedule, had forgotten, if she had ever fully registered it, the interaction that was now lodged in the memory of the person on the other side of it, like a splinter that couldn't be reached. A dresser who served in the royal household through the 1990s described an incident that she returned to repeatedly in the years after she left service. It was, she was careful to say, not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that would register as significant to anyone reading it from the outside. But it had stayed with her, she said, because of what it revealed about the specific quality of Elizabeth's attention and the uses to which she put it. The dresser had been with the household for 3 years at the time. She knew the routine. She was competent, more than competent, by her own assessment and by the assessment of the senior staff who oversaw her work. She had learned the code. She had made the psychological adjustment. She had redirected her need for acknowledgement toward the abstract satisfaction of doing her job well, and she had largely succeeded in convincing herself that this was enough. And then one morning she made an error. It was a small error, a matter of sequencing, a garment presented in the wrong order, a detail of the morning preparation that deviated fractionally from the established routine, the kind of error that, in any other household, would have been corrected with a word and forgotten within minutes. Elizabeth did not say a word. She looked at the garment. She looked at it for slightly longer than she would have looked at it if everything had been correct. And then she looked at the dresser, and the dresser said, and she described this with a precision that suggested the memory had been replayed many times, examined from many angles, never quite resolved, that the look lasted perhaps 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and in those 3 or 4 seconds she felt something that she spent considerable time afterward trying to find the right language for. She said it was not anger, it was not contempt exactly, it was something more final than either of those things. It was assessment, complete, rapid, and utterly without appeal. The look of a person who has updated their internal record of you and found the updated version slightly less adequate than the previous one. And then it was over. The Queen said nothing. The morning continued. The garment was corrected. Everything proceeded exactly as it always proceeded, with the same precision and the same routine and the same complete absence of any acknowledgment that a human interaction of any significance had just occurred. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. Who asked what was wrong, exactly what had happened, or why it had affected her as deeply as it had. She said she felt, and she chose this word carefully, reduced. Not reprimanded, not corrected, reduced. As though the look had taken something from her that she hadn't known she was carrying until it was gone. She stayed for another 4 years. She said she spent most of those 4 years trying to get it back. This pattern, the reduction, the staying, the attempting to recover something that the environment had taken, appears with remarkable consistency across accounts from staff who served Elizabeth across different decades and different roles. It is not unique to any particular type of person. It appears in accounts from people who describe themselves as resilient, as professionally experienced, as entirely unsentimental about the nature of royal service. It appears in accounts from people who had worked in demanding environments before and thought they understood what demanding meant. They did not understand what demanding meant. Not until they worked for her. A senior footman who served through the 2000s described a specific dynamic that he observed, not in his own interactions with the Queen, but in the interactions of colleagues, a dynamic that he said operated so consistently that it began to feel less like individual behavior and more like institutional policy. He called it the rotation of favor. What he meant was this: Elizabeth had, at any given time, a small number of staff members toward whom her attention was fractionally warmer than it was toward others. Not warm in any absolute sense. Warmth, in the conventional meaning of the word, was not something she dispensed, but comparatively warmer, more acknowledged, more seen, and those staff members, the ones currently inside the rotation of favor, were visibly, sometimes painfully visibly, different from the ones outside it. They stood differently. They moved through the household with a quality of ease that the others lacked. They spoke in meetings with a confidence that was grounded, he said, not in their own certainty but in the knowledge that they currently existed, in her field of perception, as slightly more than furniture. And then the rotation would shift, without explanation, without any identifiable cause that the person losing favor could point to and say, "There, that is what I did wrong, that is what I need to correct." The warmth would simply migrate, move to someone else. And the person left behind would spend days or weeks trying to understand what had changed, what they had done, how they could reverse it. And while they were doing that, while they were performing the exhausting internal audit that the rotation of favor inevitably produced, their work would suffer fractionally, which would make the favor less likely to return, which would make the audit more intense, which would make the work suffer further. It was, he said, a perfect closed loop. He did not believe she designed it consciously. He was insistent on that point, that he did not think she sat down and calculated how to keep her staff in a state of perpetual anxious striving. He thought it was simply the natural output of a person who had been trained to dispense acknowledgment strategically, deployed in an environment where acknowledgment was the primary currency, operating over decades with a staff that had no alternative source of the thing they needed. The loop ran itself. She didn't have to maintain it, it maintained itself. There were, additionally, the specific incidents that crossed the line from the psychologically demanding into something that the people who experienced them described in the privacy of diaries and late-night conversations with trusted former colleagues as cruelty. Not dramatic cruelty, not the operatic, visible cruelty of a person who raises their voice and throws things and makes their displeasure a spectacle, but the quiet, surgical cruelty of a person who knows exactly where another person's vulnerability is located and applies pressure to it with a precision that could, if challenged, always be attributed to something other than intention. A private secretary who served in the 1980s described an occasion on which he had made a recommendation, a professional recommendation, within the scope of his role, about a matter of some significance to the household. He had researched the recommendation carefully. He had prepared his case. He had presented it in exactly the form that the protocol required. And she had listened. She had listened with the particular quality of attention that he had learned, by that point in his service, to read with some accuracy. And when he finished, she had said nothing for a moment. And then she had said, in a tone of voice that was entirely level and entirely without inflection, "Is that your considered opinion?" Not a question, a statement. 3 words delivered in a tone that contained, for anyone with the contextual literacy to receive it, an entire assessment of him and his judgment, and the value of the recommendation he had just spent 3 weeks preparing. He said yes, because what else do you say? She moved on. The recommendation was neither accepted nor rejected in any formal sense. It simply ceased to be discussed. It disappeared into the administrative silence of the household, and he never heard it referenced again, and the matter it addressed was eventually resolved through a different channel, through a recommendation from someone else, through a process that made no reference to his work or his analysis, or the 3 weeks he had spent on it. He said that he had, in the years since, tried to assess whether what she had done constituted deliberate diminishment or simply the efficient operation of a person with too many demands on her attention to invest in the careful management of a subordinate's professional feelings. He said he was still not certain. He said he suspected she was not certain either. And somehow, he said, that uncertainty was the worst part. Because deliberate cruelty at least implies recognition, implies that the person on the receiving end registered as significant enough to warrant the deliberate application of harm. But cruelty that operates without full awareness, cruelty that is so embedded in the structure of a person's character that it functions automatically, without conscious deployment, that kind of cruelty says something else entirely. It says, you were not significant enough to be cruel to on purpose. You were simply in the way, and the institution rolled over you the way institutions always roll over the people inside them, without malice, without awareness, without any particular interest in what it cost you. Because cost, inside that household, was something that only flowed in one direction, downward, always toward the people with the least power to refuse it. The 1970s were, by almost any measure, the most turbulent decade of Elizabeth's reign up to that point. The country was coming apart at the seams in ways that felt, to the people living through it, genuinely unprecedented. The economy was in freefall. The unions were at war with the government. The lights went out across Britain with a regularity that would have seemed farcical if the underlying reality hadn't been so grim. Northern Ireland was bleeding. The empire was gone. Not recently gone, not gone in a way that still carried the shock of novelty, but gone in the settled, permanent way that forces a nation to confront, without the distraction of ongoing loss, the question of what it actually is when it is no longer what it was. And at the center of all of it, unchanging, unreadable, performing the function that the institution required of her with the same composed precision that she had performed it in the 1950s and would continue to perform it into the new century. Elizabeth. The same face, the same posture, the same measured quality of public presence that the nation had come to depend on in a way that was, when you examined it closely, less about admiration than about need. The country needed her to be stable because the country was not stable. The country needed her to be constant because everything else was changing. And she provided that constancy with a reliability that was, in its way, genuinely extraordinary. But inside the palace, the 70s were something else. Inside the palace, the 70s were the decade when the particular internal culture that Elizabeth had spent 20 years constructing began to show its costs in ways that could no longer be entirely managed or contained. Staff turnover, which had always been higher than the palace's public image suggested, accelerated. The informal networks through which former staff communicated, carefully, obliquely, always with one eye on the legal obligations they had signed, began to carry more distress than they had carried before. And a small number of incidents occurred that, while never reaching the press and never becoming part of the official or unofficial historical record in any documented form, circulated within those networks with a persistence that suggested they had landed on something true about the environment that produced them. The first of these involved a member of the domestic staff, a woman who had been with the household for nearly a decade and who was regarded by all accounts as one of the most competent and most personally contained members of the below-stairs operation. She was not someone who made demands. She was not someone who expressed needs. She had absorbed the code more completely than almost anyone around her and had constructed, over 10 years of service, a professional identity so thoroughly adapted to the requirements of the environment that her colleagues sometimes described her as more palace than person, and meant it, in the specific way that people inside that world meant it, as the highest possible compliment. And then, over the course of several months in the mid-70s, something changed. The change was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change that produced an incident, a confrontation, a moment that could be pointed to and examined. It was subtler than that. It was the kind of change that only the people in immediate proximity could perceive. A slight slowing in her movements, a quality of flatness in her expression that had not been there before, a tendency to pause fractionally too long before responding to requests in a way that suggested the response was costing her more than it should. The senior staff noticed. Of course they noticed. The senior staff inside the palace noticed everything, because noticing everything was the primary skill that the environment selected for and rewarded. But noticing and acting on what you noticed were two different things, and the culture of the household was not structured in a way that made acting easy. There was no mechanism for addressing what was happening to her. There was no framework within which a senior member of staff could say to the woman at the center of everything, "Someone who works for you is struggling, and the environment that you have created and that your presence sustains is the reason, and something needs to change." That conversation was not available. It was not available because the culture that would have made it available, the culture of direct communication, of acknowledged feeling, of institutional responsibility for the psychological welfare of the people inside the institution, was precisely the culture that Elizabeth's particular form of leadership had made impossible. You cannot create an environment in which emotional expression is systematically suppressed and then be surprised when the suppressed emotion finds nowhere to go. But she was apparently surprised, or something that functioned like surprise. A brief, visible disruption of the composed surface was observed by at least 2 members of staff on the occasion when the woman eventually did what the environment had made inevitable. She broke. Not dramatically, not in a way that became a scene or a story or a moment of institutional crisis. She simply reached, one morning, the point that people reach when they have been containing something for too long without any mechanism for release, and she sat down in one of the service corridors, and she could not get up again. She was not discovered by Elizabeth. She was discovered by a junior colleague who fetched a senior member of staff who managed the situation with the particular combination of efficiency and emotional distance that the culture produced in the people who rose within it. The woman was helped to her feet, she was given tea, she was given the remainder of the day, and she was back at her post the following morning, performing her function with the same precision as always. The incident sealed away in the institutional silence that absorbed everything that the palace did not wish to examine. But the two members of staff who had observed Elizabeth's moment of near surprise described it afterward with a specificity that suggested it had registered as significant. They said that for just a moment, a fraction of a moment, the kind of interval that you would miss entirely if you weren't watching with the particular attentiveness that working in that environment trained into you. Her face had done something unexpected, not softened exactly, not moved in the direction of what most people would recognize as human concern, but shifted as though some internal register had been momentarily disturbed by the information that a person in her household had reached their limit, and the limit had something to do with her. And then the shift was over, and her face returned to its default, and the day continued. The second significant pattern that emerged in the 70s involved the specific treatment of staff who showed any sign of individuality that the code deemed excessive. This was not new. The suppression of individual personality was as old as the institution itself, and Elizabeth had been enforcing it, consciously or not, since the earliest years of her reign. But in the 70s, for reasons that may have had something to do with the broader cultural shifts happening outside the palace walls, the loosening of deference, the erosion of the automatic respect for authority that had structured British social life for generations, the enforcement became more visible, more frequent, and, by the accounts of the people on the receiving end of it, more pointed. A young footman who joined the household in 1973 described his first year as a process of systematic personality removal. He had arrived, he said, with what he described as a fairly normal human complement of opinions, preferences, reactions, and ways of being in the world. He was 22. He was enthusiastic. He was, in his own assessment, good at his job and aware of being good at it in the way that competent young people often are. Not arrogantly, but with a quiet confidence that expressed itself in the way he moved and spoke and engaged with the people around him. Within 6 months, he said, the confidence was gone. Not through any single incident, not through a reprimand or a formal correction or a confrontation of any kind. Through the accumulated weight of small moments, a look here, a silence there, the subtle social pressure of an environment in which any expression of individual presence above a certain minimal threshold was registered as a deviation from the required standard. He learned to make himself smaller. He learned to occupy less space, to project less personality, to move through the household with the particular quality of deliberate invisibility that the environment rewarded. He said that by the end of his first year, he had become so thoroughly adapted to the requirements of the environment that he found himself doing it outside the palace as well. At home with his family, at the pub with friends he had known since childhood, suppressing the reactions, monitoring the expressions, maintaining the composure that had been trained into him so completely that it had begun to operate automatically, without conscious effort, in contexts where it had no function and served no purpose. His mother noticed before he did. She said to him, on a visit home sometime in his second year, that he seemed different. Not unhappy exactly, but quieter, contained in a way that he had never been before. She asked if something had happened. He said no. Everything was fine. The job was going well. And then he went back to his flat and sat for a long time trying to understand why the question had produced, somewhere behind the composure, something that felt very much like grief. He stayed for 4 years. He said the last 2 were easier than the first 2, because by then the adaptation was complete and the grief had found somewhere to live inside the containment, rather than pressing against it. He said he was not sure whether that was a good thing or a terrible thing. He said he suspected it was both. The 70s also produced something else, something that the accounts of former staff from this period return to with a frequency that suggests it was not incidental but structural. It produced a specific kind of loyalty that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with the particular psychological dynamic that long-term exposure to Elizabeth's form of leadership created in the people around her. It was the loyalty of people who had invested too much to leave, who had given too much of themselves to the environment, too much personality, too much need, too much of the ordinary human expectation of reciprocity, to walk away without that investment meaning something. They stayed because leaving would mean admitting that what they had given had produced nothing in return, and that admission, for most of them, was the one thing harder than staying. So they stayed, and the decade turned, and the palace moved forward, as it always moved forward, without looking back, without accounting for what it had cost the people it had consumed, without any mechanism for acknowledging that consumption or addressing its consequences. Elizabeth moved forward with it, composed, unreadable, entirely, devastatingly intact. When Diana Spencer arrived at the palace in 1981, she brought something with her that the institution had not encountered in a very long time, possibly had never encountered in the specific form she carried it, and absolutely did not know what to do with. She brought need. Not need in the private, carefully managed, strategically suppressed form that the palace had learned to contain and redirect and absorb without visible disruption, but need in its raw, unconcealed, entirely unmanaged form. The need to be seen, the need to be held, the need to be told, regularly and convincingly, that she was loved and valued and that her presence in the world mattered to the people around her. The need, in short, for exactly the things that the institution she was marrying into had spent centuries systematically eliminating from its operational culture. She was 19 years old. She had no idea what she was walking into, and the woman at the center of that institution, the woman who was now, by the logic of the marriage Diana was entering, her mother-in-law, had spent 60 years becoming precisely the opposite of what Diana needed, had spent 60 years constructing, layer by careful layer, the kind of internal architecture that made the dispensing of unconditional warmth not just unlikely, but structurally impossible, had spent 60 years in an environment where need was weakness, and weakness was danger, and the only safe response to the need of others was the measured, strategic, entirely controlled offering of just enough acknowledgment to maintain function. The collision was, in retrospect, inevitable. But what made it historically significant, what elevated it from a family drama into something that illuminated the deepest mechanics of how Elizabeth operated, and what her particular form of leadership actually cost, was not the collision itself. It was the specific way in which Elizabeth responded to it, or more precisely, did not respond to it. Staff who were present in the household during the early years of Charles and Diana's marriage described the dynamic between the two women with a consistency that is striking given the range of perspectives they represented. They came from different parts of the household. They had different roles, different levels of access, different relationships with the people they were observing, but their descriptions converged on a single, specific quality. Elizabeth watched. She watched Diana struggle. She watched the 19-year-old girl navigate an institution that had been designed for people who arrived already broken to its requirements, already emptied of the particular human qualities that the institution found inconvenient. She watched Diana make the mistakes that any person would make in that environment without preparation or support, the spontaneous emotional expressions, the unguarded moments, the occasional eruptions of feeling that the code absolutely forbade, and that Diana, in those early years, was entirely incapable of preventing. And Elizabeth watched, not with visible coldness, not with observable disapproval in most instances, with the particular quality of attention that her staff had learned to recognize over decades of service, the attention of a person processing information, assessing, updating internal records, reaching conclusions that she would never articulate directly but that would express themselves, over time, through the specific texture of her behavior, through what she said and what she did not say, through who she acknowledged and who she looked past, through the slow, inexorable shift in the temperature of the household around a person who had been assessed and found, not maliciously but definitively, to be more disruption than the institution could comfortably absorb. A lady-in-waiting who served during this period described a specific incident from the early months of the marriage that she returned to repeatedly when discussing the dynamic between the two women. Diana had been having a difficult day. The specific nature of the difficulty was private, a personal matter, an emotional weight that she was carrying in the visible, physical way that Diana always carried things, that had never learned the palace's method of internalization. She was not crying. She was not making a scene. But she was visibly, unmistakably struggling in a way that anyone with functioning human perception could see. Elizabeth passed her in a corridor. The lady-in-waiting, who was present, watched. She watched Elizabeth's eyes register Diana's state, register it with the completeness and accuracy of a person whose perceptual faculties had been sharpened by decades of operating in an environment where reading people was a survival skill. She watched Elizabeth absorb the information, process it. And then she watched Elizabeth continue walking. No pause, no acknowledgement, no offer of the thing that Diana was so visibly in need of, just the continuation of forward motion, measured and composed, and entirely without break. The lady-in-waiting said she stood in the corridor for a moment after Elizabeth had passed, trying to identify the feeling that the incident had produced in her. And she said what she arrived at, after some time, was not anger at Elizabeth, it was something closer to recognition. The recognition of a person who had been inside the institution long enough to understand that what she had just witnessed was not a failure of human empathy in the conventional sense. It was the institution operating exactly as it had always operated. It was Elizabeth being exactly what 60 years of training and adaptation and deliberate self-construction had made her. She was not capable of stopping. Not because she didn't see Diana's pain, she saw it clearly. Her perceptual faculties were, if anything, more acute than those of the people around her. But seeing and responding were, for Elizabeth, entirely separate operations. And the response that Diana needed, the warmth, the direct acknowledgement, the simple human gesture of stopping and saying, "I see that you are struggling and that matters to me." That response required a kind of emotional availability that the institution had spent 60 years training out of the woman in that corridor. The institution had done its work too well, and Diana was paying for it. The staff watched this dynamic unfold over months and then years with a collective response that was more complicated than simple sympathy for Diana, because many of them understood, from their own experience, exactly what Diana was experiencing. They had felt the specific quality of Elizabeth's non-response. They had stood in their own corridors, carrying their own weights, and watched her pass. They knew what it meant to be seen and not acknowledged. They knew what it cost. But they also knew something that Diana, in those early years, did not know. They knew that the non-response was not targeted. It was not personal in the way that Diana experienced it as personal. It was universal. It was applied with perfect consistency to everyone in the household. Staff, courtiers, family members, the Princess of Wales herself. Elizabeth did not withhold warmth from Diana specifically. She withheld it from everyone. And understanding that, really understanding it in the bones, required a particular kind of time and exposure that Diana was not going to be given, because the institution was not patient with people who needed things from it. The institution had never been patient with that. A senior footman who served through the 1980s described the atmosphere of the household during the years of the Wales marriage as the most uncomfortable of his entire career. Not because of any single incident, not because of anything that could be documented or cited or pointed to as evidence of institutional failure, but because of what he called the specific discomfort of watching two completely incompatible things occupy the same space and knowing, with absolute certainty, that only one of them was going to survive the encounter. He knew which one it was going to be. Everyone inside the household knew. The institution always survived. The institution had been surviving for centuries, absorbing disruptions and crises and individual human beings who arrived with the naive belief that their particular form of need or strength or personality would be the thing that finally changed it. And the institution absorbed them all. It took what it could use and discarded what it could not, and it continued forward, unchanged in any fundamental way, carrying its traditions and its silences and its particular form of operational coldness into the next decade and the next crisis and the next person who arrived, believing they could be the exception. Diana was not the exception. She was not going to be the exception. And Elizabeth, watching, assessing, processing, reaching the conclusions that she never articulated directly, understood this with a certainty that her staff could read in the specific quality of her stillness on the occasions when the two women were in the same room together. There was no hostility in that stillness. There was no visible satisfaction, no cruelty that expressed itself in any observable form. There was simply the composed, complete, entirely untroubled presence of a person who has encountered a disruption and has already, at some level below conscious awareness, processed it as temporary. The disruption would resolve itself. Disruptions always resolved themselves. The institution would continue. It always continued. What the staff found most difficult to articulate and most returned to in their private accounts and late-night conversations and the carefully worded memoirs that some of them eventually produced was not Elizabeth's treatment of Diana specifically. It was what that treatment revealed about the total, absolute, structurally complete nature of the coldness. Because if you could watch a 19-year-old girl struggling in your corridor and walk past her without breaking stride, if you could do that not out of malice, but simply because the machinery of your self-construction had made the alternative unavailable, then the coldness was not a behavior, it was not a choice, it was not even in any meaningful sense a flaw. It was the person. It was the complete, finished, irreversible product of everything that Elizabeth had been made into by the institution she served and the training she had received and the 60 years of daily, hourly, relentless practice of being exactly what the crown required. She was the coldness, and the coldness was her. And Diana, who had arrived needing warmth more than she needed almost anything else, had walked directly into the center of it and would spend the next decade trying to understand why it felt, despite all evidence to the contrary, so specifically, so personally, so devastatingly like rejection. It was not rejection. It was something worse. It was indifference so complete and so structural that it had ceased to be indifference in the active sense and had become simply the weather. You do not take the weather personally, but you feel it. God, you feel it every single day. There is a specific moment that former royal staff describe, each in their own language, but always with the same essential quality, that marks the point at which a person inside the palace transitions from participant to potential threat. It is not the moment they decide to speak. It comes before that. It is the moment they realize, with a clarity that arrives suddenly and cannot be undisputed afterward, that the institution they have served, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, does not regard them as a person who has given something valuable and deserves something in return. It regards them as a liability, a managed liability, for as long as they remain inside the system, an active threat. The moment they step outside it, the palace had mechanisms for managing this transition. It had been developing and refining those mechanisms for centuries, long before Elizabeth arrived to preside over them, and the sophistication of those mechanisms by the time she was on the throne was considerable. Legal instruments primarily. The confidentiality agreements that staff signed upon entering royal service were not standard employment contracts with a privacy clause appended. They were comprehensive, carefully drafted documents that bound the signatory to silence on a range of topics so broad that several former staff members, when they eventually consulted lawyers about what they were and were not permitted to say, discovered that the agreement they had signed years or decades earlier still had sufficient reach to make any meaningful disclosure legally hazardous. But the legal instruments were only one layer, the more effective layer, the one that operated before the lawyers became necessary, the one that made most people decide not to speak long before the question of legal consequence ever arose, was social. It was the specific form of social pressure that the palace had perfected over generations. The pressure of belonging, the pressure of identity, the pressure that came from having constructed, over years of royal service, a professional and personal self so thoroughly organized around the institution and its requirements that the prospect of standing outside it felt not just professionally risky but existentially disorienting. Who were you if you were not someone who had served the crown with discretion and loyalty and the particular form of selfless dedication that the institution demanded and rewarded with the coin of proximity? Who were you if you broke the code? Most people were not willing to find out. But some were. And what happened to the ones who spoke? The ones who broke the code, who decided that what they had witnessed and experienced inside that household was more important than the consequences of disclosing it. What happened to them tells you more about Elizabeth and the institution she presided over than almost anything else in this story. The first and most significant test of the palace's response to disclosure came not from a member of the below-stairs staff, but from someone considerably closer to the centre, a person whose access had been intimate and whose account, when it eventually emerged, carried a weight of specificity and credibility that the palace's standard dismissal mechanisms were not entirely equipped to handle. The response, when it came, was swift, and it was instructive, because the palace's response to disclosure was never simple denial. Simple denial was for amateurs, for institutions that had not had centuries to refine their crisis management into something considerably more sophisticated. The palace's response operated on multiple levels simultaneously, with a coordination that, given the official position that the palace did not engage in coordinated responses to press coverage, was remarkable. The first level was procedural. The person who had disclosed was reminded, through appropriate legal channels, of the obligations they had undertaken. The reminder was not threatening in any explicit sense. It did not need to be. The language of legal correspondence is its own form of threat, and the palace's legal correspondence had been drafted by people who understood this with great precision. The second level was reputational. Not through any direct campaign, nothing so crude as that, nothing that could be traced back to an institutional source and cited as evidence of coordinated character assassination. Through the specific mechanism of strategic availability, certain people with connections to the palace, people whose relationship with the institution gave their commentary a particular authority, became suddenly conveniently available to journalists and broadcasters who were covering the disclosure, and those people said things, measured things, concerned things, things that raised questions about the motivation of the person who had spoken, about the context in which their account should be understood, about the particular lens through which their experience of royal service had been filtered, and the ways in which that lens might have distorted what they believed they had seen. They did not say the person was lying. They did not need to. They said, with great care and great precision, that the full picture was more complicated than the disclosure suggested, that royal service, like any demanding professional environment, could be experienced very differently by different people, that it would be unfortunate if the account of one individual, however sincerely offered, were taken as representative of something more systemic. The implication was clear. This person had not understood what they were part of, had not had the maturity, the perspective, the institutional literacy to interpret their experience correctly, had taken something personal and presented it as structural, had, in short, mistaken the ordinary demands of extraordinary service for something that warranted public examination. It was masterfully done, and it worked. Not always completely, not always immediately, but with sufficient consistency to establish a pattern that potential disclosures could observe and factor into their calculations. The cost of speaking was not just legal. It was not just professional, though the professional consequences were real and lasting. Former royal staff who had broken the code found that certain doors, in certain worlds, were quietly and permanently closed to them afterward in ways that were never explicitly connected to their disclosure, but that the timing made unmistakable. The cost of speaking was the loss of the identity that royal service had constructed for them, and for many of the people who had given years of their lives to the institution, that identity was the most valuable thing they possessed. It was the return on the investment, the thing that made the suppression and the reduction and the endless, exhausting performance of perfect function worth something. To speak was to forfeit that, to become, in the eyes of the world that had previously regarded them with the particular respect that proximity to royalty confers, simply a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. The palace understood this perfectly. It had always understood this. A former press secretary who worked adjacent to the royal household during the 1990s described the calculation with a frankness that suggested sufficient distance from the institution to permit honesty. He said that the palace's management of disclosure was not reactive. It was not a crisis response assembled hurriedly when a threat emerged. It was an ongoing, institutionalized practice, a set of relationships and mechanisms and prepared positions that were maintained continuously, precisely because disclosure was understood to be not a possibility, but a certainty. People would always eventually speak. Some people, the ones who had been most damaged, the ones who had reached the point where the cost of silence exceeded the cost of speaking. And when they spoke, the response was ready. He said the readiness was the most chilling part, because readiness implied anticipation, and anticipation implied knowledge. The palace knew, had always known, that what happened inside its walls to the people who served there was something that those people would eventually need to speak about. The readiness was an acknowledgment of that, a tacit admission, never made explicitly, never permitted to surface in any form that could be cited or quoted or presented as evidence, that the institution understood what it was doing to the people inside it and had prepared accordingly, not to stop doing it, to manage the consequences of doing it. There was a specific case, documented in fragments across several accounts from people who were present or adjacent at the time, involving a member of staff who had served for over a decade and who, following their departure from royal service, had begun speaking to a journalist, not for publication initially. Exploratory conversations, the kind of conversations that people who have been carrying something heavy for a long time have when they finally find someone willing to listen. The palace became aware of the conversations before they had produced anything publishable. What followed was described by the staff member in a conversation with a former colleague years later as the most efficient dismantling of a person's professional and social standing that they had ever witnessed. Not through any single dramatic action, through the accumulated effect of small things. A reference that was not provided when expected, a professional introduction that did not materialize, a social invitation that stopped coming, the specific texture of a world contracting around a person in ways that each individually could be attributed to coincidence, but that collectively could not. The journalist eventually moved on to other stories. The staff member never spoke publicly. They described the experience in that later conversation with the former colleague, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted clarity. They said they had understood, by the end of it, something about the institution that they had not understood when they were inside it. They said, when you are inside, you think the power is about the crown, about the history, about the symbolism. You think the power is ceremonial. But it is not. The power is operational. The power is the ability to make your world smaller without ever appearing to touch it. The power is the smile and the wave and the public image of benign, gracious, entirely non-threatening dignity, and the absolute, ruthless, perfectly organized machinery that runs underneath it. She presided over that machinery, not by managing it directly, not by issuing instructions or making calls, or involving herself in the operational details of how threats were managed, but by being what she was, by being the thing that the machinery existed to protect, and by being so completely, so convincingly, so photographically perfect in her public presentation that any challenge to the institution she embodied could always be made to look, in contrast with that perfection, like small-mindedness, like ingratitude, like the failure of comprehension of people who had been given an extraordinary privilege and had not had the grace or the wisdom to receive it correctly. The machinery ran. The world contracted around the people who spoke, and Elizabeth moved through it all. The ceremonies and the crises and the managed disclosures and the quietly ruined careers, with the same composed, unreadable, entirely intact presence that she had always moved through everything, seeing everything, responding to nothing, protected completely and permanently by the institution that had made her and that she in turn had spent 70 years making stronger. 1992 was the year that Elizabeth herself named. She stood at the Guildhall in November of that year at a lunch held to mark the 40th anniversary of her accession, and she described the preceding 12 months as her annus horribilis, her horrible year. The phrase was Latin, which was appropriate, because Latin creates distance, and distance was always Elizabeth's preferred operating mode. It translated the personal into the classical. It elevated the specific human disaster of what had happened to her family into something with the weight of history behind it, something that sounded less like a mother watching her children's marriages collapse in public, and more like a monarch observing the turbulence of an era from the composed remove of institutional perspective. The phrase was carefully chosen. Everything she said publicly was carefully chosen. But what the phrase concealed, what the Latin and the composure and the Guildhall setting and the 40 years of practiced public presentation all combined to conceal, was the specific texture of what 1992 had actually been inside the palace, what the staff had witnessed, what the family had experienced, and what Elizabeth's response to the cascade of crises that defined that year revealed with a clarity that her normal operating mode made impossible, about the person underneath the institution. The year had begun badly and proceeded to get worse with a momentum that felt, to the people inside the household, almost mechanical. Anne's divorce from Mark Phillips was formalized in April. The photographs of Andrew's wife Sarah Ferguson in compromising circumstances with another man were published in August. Charles and Diana's separation was announced in December, and in between, threading through all of it like a dark current that gave the year its particular character, was the ongoing collapse of the Wales marriage. A collapse that had been visible to the palace for years, that had been managed and contained and denied with diminishing effectiveness, and that was now, with the publication of Andrew Morton's book in June, entirely and irrevocably beyond management. The book landed like a detonation inside the palace. The immediate response was the response that the institution always deployed when confronted with a disclosure it could not suppress: controlled dismissal. The palace did not comment directly on the book's contents. It did not need to. The network of people with institutional connections and strategic availability went to work, and within days of publication, the media landscape was populated with voices raising questions about the book's reliability, Diana's motivations, the context in which her apparent disclosures should be understood. It was the standard playbook, but the standard playbook had been written for a different scale of crisis, because Morton's book was not a disgruntled staff member speaking to a journalist. It was the Princess of Wales speaking, in her own voice, about her own experience of the institution that Elizabeth presided over. And what she said about the isolation, the coldness, the systematic withdrawal of support, the specific quality of being inside that household, and finding it entirely unable to provide the basic human acknowledgment that she needed to function, was not something that the dismissal machinery could fully neutralize, because too many people had felt it themselves. Not inside the palace, outside it. Ordinary people, millions of them, who had never been within 100 miles of Buckingham Palace, but who recognized, in Diana's account, something that resonated with their own experience of institutions that prioritized their own continuity over the welfare of the people inside them. Something that resonated with their own experience of being reduced, of being managed, of being held at the precise arm's length that the machinery required. Diana had given language to something that the public had not previously had language for, and Elizabeth, watching, processing, reaching the conclusions that she never articulated directly, understood that this was different, that the scale of the disruption was different, that the standard mechanisms were not going to be sufficient. But her response, and this is the part that the staff who were present in the household during this period returned to most consistently in their subsequent accounts, her response was not what the situation seemed to require. It was not a pivot. It was not a recalibration. It was not the kind of institutional self-examination that the scale of the crisis arguably demanded. It was an intensification, a doubling down on the very qualities that had produced the crisis in the first place. More composure, more distance, more of the precise, measured, entirely composed public presence that the institution required and that the private person had long since become indistinguishable from. A senior courtier who served through the entirety of 1992 described the atmosphere inside the palace during the months following the Morton publication as the strangest of his career. Not because of the chaos. There was chaos, certainly, the particular administrative and communications chaos of an institution whose public narrative had been seized by someone it could not control, but because of the specific quality of Elizabeth's presence within that chaos. He said that she moved through it with a stillness that he found, depending on his mood when he thought about it afterward, either deeply admirable or deeply alarming. She was not unaware of what was happening. She was acutely, precisely, completely aware of what was happening. Her intelligence networks inside the household were comprehensive, and her capacity for processing complex institutional information was, by any measure, extraordinary. She knew the scale of the damage. She knew what Morton's book had done and was continuing to do to the public standing of the institution. She knew that the situation was not going to resolve itself through the application of standard mechanisms. She knew all of this, and she responded with stillness, with the particular stillness of a person who has decided, at some level below conscious deliberation, that the correct response to disruption is to be more completely what you already are, to intensify the composure, to deepen the distance, to present to the chaos around you a surface so smooth and so complete and so entirely without visible seam that the chaos has nothing to grip. It was, the courtier said, an extraordinary thing to witness. It was also, he said, and he was careful about this, careful in the way that people who have spent long careers in proximity to power tend to be careful when they are about to say something that cannot be unsaid. It was also the wrong response, not wrong in any simple or obvious way, not wrong in the way that a tactical error is wrong, where you can point to the specific decision and trace the specific consequence. Wrong in a deeper, more structural way. Wrong in the way that a fundamental misreading of a situation is wrong. A misreading so embedded in the reader's basic orientation toward the world that it does not register as misreading at all, but simply as seeing clearly. She misread what the public needed from her. She had always, the courtier suggested, misread what the people around her needed from her. And for most of her reign, that misreading had not mattered enormously because the public had been willing, had been culturally conditioned to supply the warmth themselves, to project onto the composed, unreadable surface whatever they needed to see there, to interpret the distance as dignity and the coldness as strength, and the absolute absence of visible feeling as the appropriate posture of a woman carrying an impossible weight. Diana had changed that. Diana had given the public a different framework, a framework in which warmth was not weakness, in which emotional availability was not an institutional liability, but a human necessity, in which the composed, unreadable surface was not dignity but absence, the specific, painful absence of the thing that the people around her most needed. And now the public was applying that framework to Elizabeth and finding her wanting. The specific moment at which this became undeniable, the moment that Elizabeth's coldness stopped being a private institutional matter and became a public crisis of legitimacy, came not in 1992, but 5 years later, in August of 1997. In the specific, shattering days following Diana's death in a Paris underpass, when the public's grief was so total and so overwhelming, and so completely at odds with the palace's initial response, that the distance between the institution and the people it was supposed to represent became visible in a way that had no precedent in Elizabeth's reign. The flag above Buckingham Palace did not fly at half-mast. The Queen did not return from Balmoral. There was no public statement of personal grief, no visible acknowledgment that something had happened that warranted a departure from protocol. There was protocol, there was procedure, there was the measured, composed, entirely institutional response of a household that processed the death of the Princess of Wales the way it processed everything. Through the established mechanisms, at the established pace, with the established distance between feeling and function. And the public, who were standing outside the palace in their thousands with their flowers and their tears, and their entirely unmanaged, entirely unconcealed grief, the public saw it. They saw the flag, they saw the empty balcony, they saw the absence of the Queen, and what they felt in those specific days was not the projection they had been supplying for decades, not the warm interpretation of cold behavior that the cultural conditioning of deference had always made available. What they felt was what the staff had been feeling for years, inside the palace, in the corridors and the service rooms, and the quiet moments when the performance was momentarily suspended and the reality of what they were part of landed with its full weight. They felt the coldness, directly, personally, without the buffer of distance or the mediation of ceremony, and it shocked them, because they had not known, had not been permitted to know, by the management of information and image that the institution had maintained for decades, had been given, consistently and comprehensively, the version of Elizabeth that the palace wanted them to have, the composed grandmother, the dutiful servant of the nation, the woman who carried everything without complaint and asked for nothing in return. They had not been given the woman who walked past Diana in the corridor. They had not been given the woman whose silences reduced people to the point of not being able to get up from a service corridor floor. They had not been given the woman who presided, with complete composure and zero visible distress, over the systematic management of anyone who threatened to tell the truth about what life inside her household actually cost. They had not been given her. And now, in the specific raw grief of those August days, they were getting a glimpse, and the glimpse was enough. It was enough to make the public do something they had not done before, not in this specific, direct, uncomfortable way. They demanded something from her. They demanded that she feel something visible. They demanded that the surface break, and Elizabeth, for the first time in 7 decades of public life, for the first time since the training had begun, and the construction had been completed, and the person had become so thoroughly the institution that the distinction had ceased to be operationally relevant. Elizabeth faced a demand that her composure could not simply absorb and redirect. She had to respond. And what she did, and how she did it, and what it cost her to do it, and what it revealed about the specific, structural, irreversible nature of what she had become, that is what comes next. The 31st of August 1997 was a Sunday. It was early morning in Paris. It was still dark, and in a tunnel beneath the Pont de l'Alma, in the specific wreckage of a car that had been travelling too fast through a space that offered no margin for error, Diana Frances Spencer, formerly the Princess of Wales, formerly the most photographed woman in the world, formerly the person who had walked into the palace at 19 years old, carrying more need than the institution could process, died. She was 36 years old. The news reached Balmoral in the early hours of the morning. It reached Elizabeth through the established mechanisms, the specific chain of communication that the palace maintained for exactly these moments, for the moments when something happened that the institution needed to process before the world was permitted to know that the institution was processing it. The chain worked as it always worked. The information moved upward through the appropriate levels with the appropriate speed, and it reached her. And she was told. And then the 5 days began. What happened in those 5 days? not in the official account, not in the carefully managed version that the palace's communications machinery eventually produced, but in the specific, granular, witnessed reality of what occurred inside Balmoral and then inside Buckingham Palace as the situation developed, and the public response exceeded every calculation that anyone inside the institution had made, constitutes the most revealing episode of Elizabeth's entire reign. More revealing than any ceremonial occasion. More revealing than any political crisis. More revealing even than the years of Diana's marriage and the Morton book and the specific cascade of 1992, because those episodes had all been at some level manageable. They had all been situations in which the institutional mechanisms could be deployed with sufficient effect to maintain the surface, to keep the composure intact, to present to the world the face that the institution required. This was not manageable. This was something the institution had not encountered before. And watching Elizabeth attempt to manage it, watching her apply to a situation of unprecedented public emotional intensity the same tools and the same instincts and the same fundamental orientation toward feeling that had governed her behavior for 7 decades, was, for the staff who were present and the courtiers who watched, and the family members who existed in the impossible space between their own grief and the institutional requirements of their roles, it was, by every account, an experience that clarified something about her that all the years of normal operation had kept partially obscured. The first decision, the decision to remain at Balmoral, was made within hours of the news arriving. It was framed, internally, as a decision about the children. William and Harry were at Balmoral. They had just lost their mother. The appropriate response, the humane response, the response of a grandmother rather than an institution, was to keep them in a place of stability and routine rather than to subject them to the chaos of London in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. This was the reasoning. It was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete in a way that the public, standing outside Buckingham Palace in the August heat with their flowers and their handwritten notes, and their entirely unconcealed, entirely unmanaged grief, perceived immediately and instinctively. The flag above the palace flew at its standard position. There was no royal standard either, because the royal standard flies only when the monarch is in residence, and the monarch was not in residence, the monarch was in Scotland. And the combined effect of the full flagpole and the empty palace and the absence of any visible acknowledgment from the institution that something had happened that warranted a departure from the established order produced in the gathering crowds a response that the palace had not calculated for. They felt abandoned, not personally, not in any individual sense, but collectively in the specific way that a nation feels abandoned when the institution that is supposed to represent its emotional life, that is supposed to, in moments of collective grief, provide the focal point around which that grief can organize itself, is absent, is in Scotland, is maintaining protocol, is presenting to a nation that was standing in the street weeping the composed, unruffled, entirely business-as-usual face of an institution that had decided, through its established mechanisms, that the established response was the appropriate one. The staff at Balmoral during those days described an atmosphere inside the castle that was unlike anything they had experienced in their years of service. Not because of any visible disruption of the routines. The routines continued. The meals were prepared and served at the established times. The daily schedule proceeded with its habitual precision. The external structure of the household maintained itself with the completeness that the institutional culture always maintained, regardless of external circumstances. But underneath the structure, in the specific quality of the silences between interactions, in the texture of the conversations that happened in the service areas, away from the family's presence, in the way that staff looked at each other across rooms when they thought no one with authority was watching, there was something different. There was the specific discomfort of people who understood, with growing clarity as the days passed and the public response intensified, and the press coverage shifted from grief to something closer to accusation, that the situation was no longer containable by the standard mechanisms, that what was being asked of the institution, What the public, with a directness and a force that the palace had never encountered before, was demanding was not something the established playbook had a response for. The public was demanding that Elizabeth feel something, publicly, visibly, in a form that could be seen and transmitted and received by the millions of people whose grief was so total and so overwhelming that the composed, protocol-observing silence of the institution felt not like dignity, but like abandonment. They wanted her to come back. They wanted the flag to come down. They wanted to see, on the face of the woman who had spent 7 decades representing the nation's emotional life without ever fully participating in it, some evidence that what had happened had broken through, that the composure had limits, that the architecture of self-containment that Elizabeth had constructed over a lifetime had encountered, in the death of the mother of the future king, something it could not simply absorb and redirect. They wanted her to be human, and this specific demand, this historically unprecedented public pressure for visible feeling from a woman who had spent her entire life making visible feeling institutionally unavailable, was the thing that the palace did not know how to process. A senior courtier who was present at Balmoral during those days described a series of internal conversations that occurred as the scale of the public response became undeniable. These conversations, between senior staff, between courtiers, between the people whose job it was to manage the relationship between the institution and the public it served, had a quality that he said was unlike any institutional conversation he had previously been part of, because the conversations were, at their core, about a single question that the institution had never before been required to answer directly. The question was, what does she actually feel? Not what should she say, not what does protocol require, not what is the appropriate institutional response to the death of a former member of the royal family, but what does she actually feel, and is there any version of that feeling that can be made visible to the public in a way that will satisfy the demand without compromising the composure that the institution requires? He said the difficulty of answering that question, the specific, uncomfortable difficulty of a group of highly intelligent, highly experienced institutional operators trying to determine what the woman at the center of their institution actually felt about something, was itself revealing, because they did not know. After decades of service, after careers spent in daily proximity to her, after years of developing the particular perceptual acuity that the environment trained into the people who survived inside it, they did not know what she felt. They could read her silences with precision. They could interpret the specific gradations of her composure with an accuracy that amounted in practice to a form of emotional literacy. They knew, from the set of her shoulders and the quality of her stillness and the fractional changes in the way she moved through a room, whether she was displeased or satisfied or merely neutral. They had developed, over years of enforced attentiveness, a sophisticated working knowledge of the surface. But the surface was all there was. Or rather, the surface was all that was accessible. Whatever existed below it had been sealed so completely and for so long that the people around her, for all their expertise, could not reach it, could not determine, in the specific crisis of those 5 days, whether the composure they were observing was the composure of a woman who was feeling something enormous and containing it through sheer force of trained will, or the composure of a woman who had been so thoroughly constructed by the institution that the construction went all the way down, that there was no layer beneath it where ordinary human feeling resided. They could not tell, and that uncertainty, that specific vertiginous uncertainty about what was actually happening inside the most powerful woman in the country during the most public emotional crisis of her reign, was, the courtier said, the most disturbing thing he had encountered in his entire career. The decision to return to London was made on the 5th day. It was made through the same mechanisms that all palace decisions were made, through conversations between senior staff and advisors, through the weighing of institutional considerations against public relations realities, through the specific calculus of an institution determining what it needed to do to survive the particular pressure it was under. It was not made, by any account from the people involved in making it, through Elizabeth simply deciding that she needed to be with her people. It was made because the alternative, continued absence, continued protocol, continued presentation of the composed institutional face to a public that had moved over 5 days from grief to something approaching rage, had become untenable, had crossed the threshold from manageable to existentially threatening in a way that the institution could not ignore. She came back. She stood outside the palace. She looked at the flowers. And then, on the evening of the 5th day, she did the thing that she had never done before in 7 decades of public life, and would never fully do again. She broadcast. She sat before the cameras and she spoke, not with the institutional distance that characterized every other public address of her reign, with something closer, not identical, not quite the thing that the public had been demanding, but closer to the direct, personal, unmediated acknowledgment that the situation required. She said Diana was an exceptional and gifted human being. She said she spoke as a grandmother. She said she admired and respected her. The staff who watched the broadcast from various points inside the palace described their reactions with a consistency that is striking. They said it was, and they reached for this word independently across different accounts, strange. Not moving exactly, not the emotional release that the public watching from living rooms across the country experienced it as. Strange. The specific strangeness of watching a person perform an action that is recognizable as human, but that carries, for the people who know the performer well enough, the quality of something learned rather than felt, something executed rather than expressed. She had been told what was needed. She had provided it with the same precision and the same controlled competence with which she provided everything. And the nation, which needed it to be real, chose to receive it as real, because the alternative, the possibility that what they were watching was not feeling but the performance of feeling, not a grandmother speaking but an institution calculating, was not something that 5 days of raw collective grief had left them equipped to consider. They received it. They were grateful for it. And Elizabeth, having given the public the minimum that the situation required to preserve the institution, having broken the composure by the precise fraction of a degree that the crisis demanded, and not 1 degree further, returned to herself, composed, intact, exactly as she had always been. The 5 days were over. The institution had survived, and the staff, who had watched every moment of it from the inside, filed it away in the silence that the code required, and said nothing. There is a particular category of person that every institution of sufficient age and sufficient power produces, not the people who serve for a year or two and leave, carrying their experience with them like a wound that heals imperfectly but heals, not the people who break early and dramatically and spend the rest of their lives making sense of the breaking, but the people who stay, the ones who give decade after decade to the institution, who build their entire professional identity around their proximity to it, who reach the end of their working lives having spent the majority of those lives inside a single household, serving a single person, organized entirely around the requirements of a single institutional role. These are the people whose testimony matters most, not because they are the most articulate, not because their accounts are the most dramatic or the most immediately compelling, but because the length of their exposure gives their observations a depth and a precision that shorter service simply cannot produce. They have seen the institution across time. They have watched it respond to crises and absorb disruptions and continue forward unchanged in any fundamental way. They have developed, through decades of daily proximity, the kind of understanding of a person that is only available to people who have watched that person operate across enough different circumstances that the patterns become visible. They know things that nobody else knows, and what they know about Elizabeth, the specific, granular, longitudinal knowledge that comes from 20 or 30 or in some cases 40 years of service, is both more complicated and more damning than the shorter accounts suggest, because the shorter accounts describe incidents, specific moments, identifiable interactions that can be narrated with a beginning and a middle and an end. The longer accounts describe something different. They describe a totality, an environment so complete and so consistent and so thoroughly organized around a single person's particular form of emotional unavailability that it stopped being something that happened to the people inside it and became simply the condition of their existence. A woman who served in the royal household for 27 years, entering as a junior member of the domestic staff in the 1970s and retiring in a senior position in the early 2000s, described the arc of her service with a precision that suggested she had spent considerable time in the years since her retirement attempting to understand what had happened to her. She said that when she entered the household, she was a person with a fairly robust sense of herself. She had come from a working-class family in the north of England. She was practical, direct, emotionally resilient in the way that her background had trained her to be resilient, not through suppression, but through the specific toughness of a life that made ordinary demands and expected ordinary responses. She knew who she was. She knew what she felt. She knew the difference between the two. By the time she left, 27 years later, she was not entirely certain of any of those things, not in any dramatic way, not in any way that would have been visible to someone looking at her from the outside. She functioned perfectly. She had done her job with distinction for nearly 3 decades, and the institutional record of her service reflected that distinction without ambiguity. But inside, and she was careful here, careful in the way that people who have spent long careers inside environments of enforced composure tend to be careful even when they are ostensibly speaking freely. Inside, something had shifted. Something had been rearranged by the specific long-term pressure of the environment in a way that she had not fully registered while it was happening and could only perceive clearly from the distance of retirement. She said she had become, over 27 years, a person who did not quite trust her own emotional responses. Not because anything had been said to her directly about the validity of those responses. Not because she had been explicitly told that what she felt was wrong or excessive or institutionally inconvenient, but because the accumulated weight of 2.5 decades inside an environment where emotional expression was systematically treated as a deviation from the required standard had produced, at a level below conscious awareness, a habit of self-interrogation, a reflexive questioning of her own reactions before they could fully form, a tendency to intercept feeling before it could become expression, to assess it against the institutional standard, to ask, is this appropriate? Is this the correct response to this situation? Does this serve a function, or is this simply feeling? And feeling, she had learned over 27 years, was not something the environment valued. So she had learned, in the way that people always learn the things their environments require of them, to not quite trust it. She said the most disorienting part of her retirement was the specific experience of being in environments, family gatherings, social occasions, ordinary human interactions, where feeling was not only permitted but expected, where the people around her were expressing their reactions to things with an ease and an unself-consciousness that she found, initially, almost painful to witness. Not because their expressiveness offended her, but because it reminded her of something she had lost and could not entirely identify the moment of losing. She said she spent the first 2 years of her retirement learning, slowly and with considerable difficulty, to feel things again without interrogating them first. She said she was not certain she had fully succeeded. This is the cost of long service, not the dramatic cost, not the cost that produces incidents and testimonies and the specific kind of account that journalists and biographers find useful. The slow cost. The cost that operates below the threshold of awareness, that accumulates over years and decades the way water accumulates behind a dam, imperceptibly, continuously, without any single moment of crisis to mark its progress, until one day the dam is holding an amount of pressure that it was never designed to contain. A former senior footman who served for 31 years described a different dimension of the same cost. He described what happened to his relationships outside the palace, his marriage, his friendships, his relationship with his children, during the years when they were growing up and he was most thoroughly inside the institutional culture. He said that the code, the unwritten but absolutely enforced code of silence and composure and emotional containment, did not stay inside the palace walls. He had known, intellectually, that it would be difficult to maintain a strict separation between his professional culture and his personal life. He had not known how completely the professional culture would colonize the personal one. He said his wife told him, sometime in the second decade of his service, that living with him was like living with someone who was always slightly elsewhere, not absent in any obvious way, present, physically, reliably, in all the ways that the practical requirements of family life demanded, but elsewhere in some more fundamental sense, as though a portion of his attention was permanently allocated to a place she could not reach and a person she had never met, and the portion that remained for her and for their children was sufficient, she said, using the word with a flatness that he understood even at the time to be an indictment. Sufficient, but not quite enough. He said the conversation had stayed with him for the rest of his service. He said he had not known what to do with it, because the alternative, leaving the household, removing himself from the institutional culture that had produced the problem, had not felt like a real option by that point. He was too far in. His identity was too thoroughly organized around his role. The palace had become, over 15 years of service, not just where he worked but who he was. And you cannot leave who you are, so he stayed. And his wife stayed. And the sufficient but not quite enough continued for another 16 years, until his retirement produced a version of the same disorientation that the woman with 27 years of service had described, the specific, uncomfortable experience of being returned to a world that expected things from him emotionally that the palace had spent 31 years training him not to provide. He said his relationship with his wife improved significantly after he retired. He also said it had taken nearly 4 years. 4 years of conscious, effortful relearning of the emotional availability that the institution had systematically removed. Elizabeth did not know about this, and this is the distinction that the people who served longest tended to arrive at, the distinction that the longitudinal perspective made visible in a way that shorter service did not. She knew, in the way that a person of her intelligence and perceptual acuity always knew the general shape of things, without knowing or caring to know the specific human cost of the particular thing she was looking at. She knew that long service changed people. She had watched it happen across decades, had seen the specific quality of transformation that the institutional culture produced in the men and women who gave their working lives to it. She was not unaware, she was simply not invested in the awareness. It did not produce in her any visible response that her staff could identify as concern or guilt, or the particular discomfort of a person confronting evidence that they have caused harm. It produced nothing, which was, by that point in her reign, exactly what everyone who worked for her had come to expect. A former private secretary who served for 23 years and who chose his words with the particular care of someone who has spent a career in the management of sensitive communications, described his final year of service as the year in which he arrived at a specific understanding that he had been, in some sense, working toward for 2 decades. He said that he had spent 23 years trying to matter to her. Not in any personal sense, not in the way that a person wants to matter to someone they love. In the professional sense, the sense of wanting one's work to register, wanting one's judgment to be valued, wanting the accumulated expertise of 23 years of dedicated service to produce some form of acknowledgment that went beyond the functional. Some recognition that the person doing the work was not interchangeable with any other person who could technically perform the same functions. He said that in his final year, he understood that this was never going to happen. Not because he had done anything wrong, not because his work had been inadequate, but because the acknowledgment he was looking for required a form of seeing that she was structurally incapable of, required her to perceive him not as a function, but as a person. And that perception, that specific shift from functional to human, was the one shift that everything she had been made into made impossible. He said the understanding, when it arrived, was not painful in the way he had expected. It was clarifying. He said it was like putting down something very heavy that you had been carrying for so long that you had forgotten it was heavy, had forgotten that your back ached, had forgotten that there was a version of moving through the world that did not involve that particular weight. He put it down. He retired 3 months later. He said the retirement party was pleasant. She gave a brief speech. It was, he said, entirely appropriate. It acknowledged his years of service with precision and with the particular quality of institutional warmth that the occasion required. It did not see him. He had not expected it to. He had, after 23 years, finally, completely, permanently, without residual hope, stopped expecting it to. And he said that the stopping, the final, complete relinquishment of the expectation that had kept him there for 2 decades, was the closest thing to peace that his years of royal service had ever produced. There is a particular quality of observation that becomes available to people who are present at the end of something enormous. Not available in any comfortable sense. Not available as a gift or a privilege, though the people who have it sometimes describe it in those terms in retrospect, when the discomfort has had sufficient time to settle into something that can be examined without the full weight of the original experience pressing on it. It is available in the way that extreme clarity is sometimes available at moments of extreme pressure, not because the circumstances are kind, but because they are so completely unambiguous that the usual mechanisms of interpretation and softening and comfortable distance simply cease to function. The staff who were present in Elizabeth's final years had this clarity. They did not always want it, but they had it, and what it showed them, what the specific circumstances of those last years made visible in a way that the normal operating mode of the institution had always prevented, was something that the longer accounts and the more measured testimonies and the carefully worded memoirs had approached but never quite reached directly. It was the thing underneath all of it, underneath the composure and the distance and the rotation of favor and the hierarchy of silence and the specific quality of coldness that had governed the household for 7 decades. It was loneliness. Not the loneliness of a person who lacks company. Elizabeth was never without company. The household ensured that. The schedule ensured that. The relentless, precisely organized machinery of royal life guaranteed that she moved through each day surrounded by people, staff and courtiers and family members, and the endless procession of official visitors and dignitaries, representatives of the institutions that intersected with the monarchy's ceremonial function. She was never alone in the physical sense. But there is another kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with the presence or absence of other people. It is the loneliness of a person who has been so thoroughly constructed by their circumstances that the construction itself has become the barrier, the thing that stands between them and the ordinary human connection that the presence of other people is supposed to provide, but cannot, because the barrier is too complete and too deeply embedded to permit the passage of anything genuine in either direction. This is the loneliness that the staff in Elizabeth's final years began to see. Not immediately, not in any single moment that could be identified as the revelation, but gradually, as the circumstances of those years, the pandemic, Philip's death, the accelerating physical diminishment that age produces regardless of institutional position or personal willpower, stripped away, one by one, the external structures that had always kept the loneliness invisible. The pandemic came first. In March of 2020, the world contracted in ways that affected everyone, but that affected the residents of large, formal households in a specific and in some ways particularly acute manner. The ceremonies stopped. The official engagements stopped. The procession of visitors and dignitaries and representatives that had structured Elizabeth's days for 7 decades, that had provided the external scaffolding around which the institutional performance was organized, stopped, and what remained, in the absence of that scaffolding, was something that the people around her had not previously had unobstructed access to. What remained was just her, a senior member of the household staff who served at Windsor during the pandemic, described the experience of observing Elizabeth in those months with a candor that suggested the unusual circumstances had produced an unusual quality of visibility. He said that the removal of the ceremonial structure, the engagements, the audiences, the formal occasions that had always given shape and purpose to her days, produced a kind of exposure that the normal operational rhythm of the household had always prevented. You could see her, he said, in a way that the normal rhythm had never permitted. Not the queen performing the function of the queen, just a woman in her 90s, in a castle, with a reduced staff, and a husband who was himself diminished by age and illness, and the particular silence of a world that had temporarily stopped making the demands that had organized her existence for as long as she could remember. He said it was the most human he had ever seen her. He also said it was the saddest, because what the exposure revealed was not warmth held in reserve, not feeling that had been suppressed by the institutional requirements, and that now, in the absence of those requirements, could finally surface. What it revealed was the specific consequence of 7 decades of suppression, the way that the long continuous practice of containing everything had produced a kind of interior landscape that was, by this point, as ordered and as still and as fundamentally unreachable as the exterior that the world had always seen. The warmth was not held in reserve. It had been trained out so early and so completely that its absence was no longer an active suppression, but simply a condition, a state. The way things were inside, the same way they had always been inside, the way they would remain until the end. She did not know what to do with the stillness of those pandemic months. Not in any crisis sense, not in the way that the absence of structure destabilizes people who have never learned to exist without it. She was too composed for that, too thoroughly adapted to whatever circumstances presented themselves to permit anything as visible as destabilization. But in a quieter, more fundamental way, the way that a person who has always defined themselves through function confronts the temporary absence of function, and finds in that absence a question they have never had to answer before. Who are you when you are not performing the role? The staff watched her navigate this question without the tools that most people develop across a lifetime for exactly this purpose. The tools of interiority, the capacity for genuine self-reflection, for sitting with feeling rather than immediately containing it, for deriving meaning from sources that are not external and institutional and organizational. Those tools had been the casualties of the training, had been the first things sacrificed on the altar of the composure that the institution required. And now, in the specific quiet of the pandemic months, their absence was visible. Philip's death in April of 2021 produced something that the staff who witnessed it described with a particular carefulness. The carefulness of people who understood they were describing something that touched the deepest and most private layer of a woman who had spent her entire life making her deepest and most private layers inaccessible. They had been married for 73 years. Whatever the marriage had been, and it had been many things, had moved through phases of tension and distance and the specific friction of two very strong personalities, organized around incompatible institutional requirements. It had also been, by the account of everyone who observed it across its entire length, the one relationship in Elizabeth's life that operated closest to the surface. The one relationship in which the distance was fractionally shorter than it was with everyone else. The one person in her world with whom the composure was, on the rarest of occasions, permitted to be imperfect. Philip had known her before she was fully constructed. He had known the version of her that existed before the training was complete. The young woman, the girl almost, who had walked into a relationship with a man who was himself constitutionally unsuited to suppression, who expressed himself with a directness and a force that the institutional code absolutely forbade, and that he had spent his entire adult life ignoring. The friction between those two orientations, her containment and his expressiveness, had been the defining dynamic of their marriage. It had produced conflict, and it had produced distance, and it had produced, across 73 years, something that was imperfect in all the ways that long marriages are imperfect, and that was, underneath the imperfection, irreplaceable. He was the one person who had always known the difference between the institution and the person, and now the person was gone. and she was left with the institution. Only the institution. A lady in waiting, who was present in the weeks following Philip's death, described the quality of Elizabeth's grief with a precision that she said had required considerable time to arrive at. She said it was not grief in the form that she had expected, not the visible, expressed, unconcealed grief that the circumstances warranted, and that any ordinary human being would have been permitted, would have been expected to display, but a different kind of grief, a grief that expressed itself not through any departure from the composure, but through a specific quality within the composure, a weight, a heaviness that was not visible in any individual feature or gesture or expression, but that was present in the totality of her, in the way she occupied a room, in the specific quality of her stillness, in something that the lady in waiting struggled to name precisely, but eventually described as the grief of a person who does not know how to grieve, and has never learned, and is now, at 95 years old, confronting the consequences of that not knowing in the most acute possible form. She had been trained to contain everything, and so she contained this too. And the containing of this, of 73 years of marriage, of the one relationship that had operated closest to the surface, of the one person who had known the difference between the institution and the person, the containing of this was the most costly thing that the staff who were present had ever watched her do. It did not break her. Nothing broke her. That was the point. That had always been the point. The construction was too complete, and too deep, and too long established to be broken by anything that ordinary human life could produce. Not grief, not crisis, not the accumulated weight of decades of institutional service, not the death of the one person who had always known the difference. It did not break her. But something changed. In the months following Philip's death, the staff described a quality in her that had not been there before. Not softness. That word was not available in the vocabulary of Elizabeth's observable behavior, had never been available, would not become available now. But something adjacent to it, something that expressed itself in the fractional lengthening of certain interactions, in the occasional pause before she moved on to the next item of business that was a beat longer than the established rhythm required, in the specific quality of her attention on certain occasions when the interaction was with a member of staff who had served for a long time, who had given years of their life to the household, where something that was not quite warmth, but was perhaps the nearest available approximation of it, flickered briefly before the composure reasserted itself. The staff noticed, of course they noticed. They noticed, and they did not speak of it, and they did not allow themselves to invest too much in it, because they had learned, across years, and in some cases decades of service, exactly what it cost to invest in the possibility of warmth that the environment could not sustain. But they noticed, and some of them, privately, carefully, in the specific silence of their own interior lives that the institutional culture had trained them to maintain, allowed themselves to believe that what they were seeing was something real, something that the decades of construction had not quite reached, something that the loss of the one person who had known the difference had, in its finality, made fractionally more visible. They did not know if they were right. They still do not know. But they had given enough of themselves to the institution and the woman at its center to be permitted, they felt, the small grace of believing it. Even if only in private, even if only in the silence that the code had always required. Even if only there. She died on the 8th of September, 2022. At Balmoral, in Scotland. In the place she had loved most consistently across a lifetime of places that belonged to the institution rather than to her. In the specific landscape of hills and water, and the particular quality of northern light that she had returned to every summer for 7 decades, not because the institution required it, but because something in her, something below the composure, something that the training had not quite reached, needed it. The hills did not require anything of her, the landscape did not assess her, the light fell on her the same way it fell on everything else, without ceremony, without calculation, without the specific weight of a world watching and needing and demanding. She died there. and the world that had watched and needed and demanded for 70 years stopped, in the specific way that worlds stop when the thing they have organized themselves around is suddenly absent, and tried to understand what it was looking at. The tributes came immediately. They came in the volume and with the intensity that the death of a figure of her stature inevitably produces, from governments and institutions and individuals across the world, from people who had met her and people who had never come close, from nations that had direct and complicated relationships with the institution she embodied, and from nations whose relationship with that institution was more distant, but whose recognition of her particular form of historical significance was genuine nonetheless. The tributes used words that had been used about her for decades: duty, service, dedication, composure, strength. They were not wrong, exactly. They were incomplete because the tributes described the institution, they described the function. They described the 70 years of ceremonial performance executed with a precision and a consistency that had no precedent in modern constitutional monarchy. They described what she had given to the role. They did not describe what the role had taken from her. And they did not describe, could not describe, because the mechanisms that had prevented the description for 7 decades did not dissolve at the moment of death, what the role and the woman who embodied it had taken from the people around her. The staff did not speak immediately. Of course they did not speak immediately. The code did not expire with the monarch. The legal obligations did not dissolve. The social pressure did not lift. The specific combination of instruments that the palace had developed and refined across decades to ensure the silence of the people inside the institution continued to operate, because institutions do not die with the individuals who lead them. They continue, they adapt, they find new centers around which to organize the same essential requirements. And the requirement for silence, for the protection of the interior life of the household from the gaze of the outside world, was as operationally necessary in the weeks after her death as it had been in any week of her reign. But some of them spoke, eventually, carefully, with the specific combination of candor and self-protection that the circumstances permitted, in interviews given months or years after her death, in memoirs that had been in preparation for longer than the timing of their publication suggested, in the private conversations that had always carried the real history of the household, and that now, with sufficient distance from the immediate consequences, began to surface in forms that the public could partially access. And what they said, taken together, assembled from the fragments and the careful phrasings and the things stated directly alongside the things that could only be implied, constituted something that the official record of her reign did not contain and was never going to contain. It constituted a reckoning, not a condemnation. The people who had served her longest and most closely were, almost without exception, resistant to condemnation, not because they lacked the language for it, not because the things they had experienced did not warrant it, but because 7 decades of proximity to a person, even a person who has cost you something significant, produces a relationship with that person that is too complicated for condemnation to fully capture. You do not spend 20 or 30 years of your life in daily service to someone and arrive at the end of it with a clean, unambiguous negative verdict. The human capacity for connection, for finding meaning in proximity, for constructing relationship out of even the most asymmetrical and most emotionally costly material, that capacity is too stubborn, too fundamental to permit simple verdicts about complex people. They did not condemn her, but they reckoned with her. And the reckoning had several distinct dimensions, each of which illuminated a different aspect of what she had been, and what she had cost, and what the institution she led had done to the people inside it across 7 decades of her reign. The first dimension of the reckoning was personal. It was the private accounting that each former member of staff conducted in the months and years following her death of what their service had given them and what it had taken. This accounting was rarely published in any direct form. It occurred in the interior space that the institutional culture had trained them to maintain, in the specific privacy of the self that the code had produced in the people it processed. But it surfaced, obliquely, in the quality of the accounts they gave, in the particular wistfulness that characterized the testimonies of people who had given something that was not returned in kind, in the specific gratitude for what the proximity had offered, the historical significance, the professional distinction, the particular quality of having been inside something enormous, alongside the specific grief for what the proximity had cost. A former senior dresser who had served for 18 years described her personal reckoning with a directness that was unusual among former staff accounts, and that she attributed, she said, to the specific freedom that came from no longer having anything to lose. She said that in the months following Elizabeth's death she had made a list, not a literal list, not something written down, but an internal accounting. On one side of the accounting, what royal service had given her, the professional experience, the historical proximity, the particular satisfaction of doing a demanding job with distinction over a long period, the friendships formed with colleagues who had shared the specific experience of the household in ways that created bonds that ordinary shared experience did not produce. On the other side, what it had cost. She said the other side was longer. Not dramatically longer, not longer in a way that produced in her any clean or simple conclusion about whether the service had been worth it, but longer in a way that she said she had not been able to fully see while she was inside the institution, because the institutional culture had not permitted the kind of clear-eyed self-assessment that the accounting required. You cannot accurately assess the cost of something while you are still paying it. The payment occupies too much of your attention. The daily requirement of the performance, the daily navigation of the code, the daily management of the need for acknowledgment that the environment could not satisfy. These things consumed the cognitive and emotional bandwidth that accurate assessment would have required. She could only see it clearly from the outside. And from the outside, the cost was considerable. The second dimension of the reckoning was institutional. It was the broader question, asked not just by former staff but by historians and journalists and the public observers who had watched the institution from a distance for decades, of what Elizabeth's particular form of leadership had produced in the monarchy she left behind. Whether the qualities that had made her extraordinary in the performance of the ceremonial function, the composure, the consistency, the absolute subordination of the personal to the institutional, had also produced structural problems that her successors would now be required to address. The answer, from most of the serious observers, was yes. Not because composure is wrong, not because consistency is a flaw or dedication a liability, but because the specific version of those qualities that Elizabeth had embodied, the version in which composure became impenetrability and consistency became rigidity and dedication required the systematic suppression of everything that could not be organized around the institutional function, had produced a household culture that the modern world, with its different expectations of institutional accountability and its different appetite for the human cost of power, was no longer willing to simply accept. The Diana episode had shown that. The 5 days had shown that. The Sussex crisis, the departure of Harry and Meghan, the interviews, the specific and public articulation of what it felt like to be inside the institution and find it unable to provide the basic human support that people in crisis require, had shown that again in a different register, with a different generation, with a directness and a media reach that made the earlier episodes seem, in retrospect, like previews. The institution kept producing the same crisis because the institution kept being organized around the same principles. The principles that Elizabeth had not invented, had inherited, had absorbed, had embodied with a completeness that made them, during her reign, functionally identical to her person, but that she had also, through 7 decades of undeviating practice, made it impossible to examine or challenge or reform from within. The third dimension of the reckoning was the most fundamental and the most difficult to resolve. It was the question of what she had known, not what she had done. That was documented in the fragments and the careful phrasings and the things implied rather than stated directly, with sufficient consistency across sufficient accounts from sufficient independent sources to constitute something approaching a record. what she had known about the cost. Whether the woman who had spent 7 decades presiding over a household that systematically reduced and diminished and psychologically compressed the people inside it had understood, at any level of awareness, what she was doing. The former staff members who addressed this question directly, and most of them addressed it because it was the question that their own reckoning most insistently produced, arrived at answers that were more complicated than either full awareness or complete ignorance. The consensus assembled from the fragments was this: she knew the surface of it. She knew, in the way that a person of her intelligence and perceptual acuity and 7 decades of operational experience could not fail to know, that the environment she presided over was demanding in ways that exceeded what most professional environments demanded. She knew that people who served her for long periods were changed by the service. She had watched it happen, had observed the specific quality of transformation that the institutional culture produced, had registered it with the accuracy that her perceptual faculties always brought to the processing of information. She knew the surface. What she did not know, what the construction that had been built around her made it impossible to know, was the depth, the specific, interior, human cost of the surface, what it felt like, from the inside, to be processed by the environment she had created, what it cost a person in the specific currency of selfhood and emotional availability and the ordinary human capacity for genuine connection, to serve her for 20 or 30 years and come out the other side changed in ways they could not fully name and could not fully repair. She did not know this, not because she lacked the intelligence to understand it, because the construction that had made her what she was had also, as an unavoidable consequence of its completeness, made her unable to fully imagine what it was like to be a person who had not been constructed the same way, to be a person who needed things, who felt things in the unconcealed, unmanaged way that the training had eliminated from her own experience so early that the elimination predated her memory of it. She could not fully imagine being them, and so she could not fully know what she cost them. And that specific structural, irreversible limitation in her capacity for the imaginative empathy that full moral awareness requires was perhaps the most honest and the most complete account of what she was. Not a monster, not a villain, not a person who chose coldness over warmth and cruelty over kindness in any simple or deliberate sense, but a person so thoroughly made by an institution and a training and a set of historical circumstances that the making had consumed, before she had the awareness to protect it, the very capacity that would have allowed her to understand what the making had cost. She was the institution, and the institution did not know how to grieve for the people it consumed. It only knew how to continue. Survival is not a simple thing. It is not the clean, binary condition that the word implies, the clear division between those who made it through and those who did not, between the people who emerged from the experience intact and the people who were broken by it. Real survival, the kind that occurs in the aftermath of long exposure to environments that extract more than they return, is a more complicated and more ongoing process than the word suggests. It is not a destination. It is not a state that you arrive at and then inhabit permanently, safely, with the experience behind you and its costs fully accounted for. It is a practice, a daily, effortful, sometimes exhausting practice of reconstructing the things that the environment took and learning to live with the things that cannot be reconstructed. The people who survived long service in Elizabeth's household, the ones who left and rebuilt and made lives that were recognizably their own again, understood this with a precision that came from having done the work, from having sat with the specific inventory of what the service had taken and engaged, seriously and without the protection of denial, with the question of what could be recovered and what was gone. Some things could be recovered, some things were gone, and the ability to distinguish between the two, to see clearly which category a given loss belonged to and to engage with each appropriately, was itself a skill that most of them had to develop after leaving, because the institutional culture had not equipped them with it. The institutional culture had equipped them with suppression and composure and the particular form of functional resilience that the environment required. It had not equipped them with the capacity for the honest self-assessment that recovery demanded. They had to learn that from scratch. At whatever age they happened to be when they left, a woman who had served for 16 years and left in her early 40s described the first year of her post-palace life as the most disorienting of her entire existence. Not because of anything that happened to her externally. Externally, the transition was managed with competence. She found work, she maintained her relationships, she moved through the practical requirements of her changed circumstances with the efficiency that 16 years of institutional training had made second nature. The external surface was fine, but inside, in the specific interior space that the institutional culture had trained her to maintain, in a particular condition of ordered stillness, something was happening that she had no framework for understanding. Things were moving, not dramatically, not in any way that produced visible disruption of the composed surface, but moving nonetheless, shifting, rearranging themselves in ways that she could feel but could not initially interpret. She described it eventually as thawing, the specific, slow, occasionally painful process of a landscape that has been frozen for a long time beginning to move again. She said it was not comfortable. Thawing never is. The movement produces its own specific discomfort, the ache of things returning to positions they had not occupied for years, the specific sensitivity of tissue that has been compressed for too long, beginning to register sensation again. She said there were days when she would be in an entirely ordinary situation, a conversation with a friend, a family gathering, a moment of routine domestic life, and something would happen, something small, a piece of music, a quality of light, a turn of phrase in something she was reading, and she would feel something arrive from somewhere that seemed simultaneously very close and very far away. Somewhere that had been inaccessible for so long that its sudden accessibility was almost frightening. She said the first time she cried in public, genuinely, uncontrollably, in a way that she could not have suppressed even if she had tried, was at a supermarket. Approximately 8 months after leaving the palace. She was standing in an aisle and a song came over the sound system and something in the song opened something in her, and she stood there and wept, in a way that she said she had not wept since she was a child. Before the training, before the code, before the systematic construction of the composure that had governed her interior life for 16 years. She said a member of staff came to ask if she was all right. She said she told them yes, she was fine, she was sorry, it was nothing. Old habits. But she said that standing in that aisle, with the tears running and the old habit of apology and minimization operating automatically alongside them, she understood something that she had not understood in 16 years of service. She understood that the tears were not nothing, that they were, in fact, the most significant thing that had happened to her in years. That the capacity for this, for the unmanaged, unconcealed, entirely unstrategic expression of feeling, was the thing the institution had taken from her, and that it was, in its return, more valuable than anything the institution had given. She stood there and let it happen. For the first time in 16 years she let it happen, and then she bought her groceries and went home and sat in her kitchen for a long time, feeling, not thinking, not analyzing, not assessing against any standard, just feeling, the specific, unfamiliar, almost overwhelming sensation of being a person who was permitted to feel things and did not have to do anything with the feeling except have it. She said it took her approximately 2 years to become comfortable with this. She said comfortable was perhaps too strong a word. She said it took her approximately 2 years to become less terrified of it. Other survivors described different dimensions of the reconstruction. A former footman, who had served for 12 years and left in his mid-30s, described the specific challenge of rebuilding his relationship with his own opinions, not his opinions about matters of public significance. Those had survived the institutional suppression relatively intact because the code had been primarily concerned with emotional expression rather than intellectual position. But his opinions about himself, his assessment of his own worth, his own capabilities, his own right to take up space in the world in ways that were not organized around the requirements of the institution he was serving, He said that 12 years of existing in Elizabeth's field of perception as something between necessary and invisible had produced in him a habitual self-diminishment that operated automatically and below the threshold of conscious awareness. He did not experience it as low self-esteem in the clinical sense. He functioned perfectly, he was competent, and he knew he was competent, and the knowledge was available to him when he needed it for professional purposes, but in the less structured spaces, in the spaces where identity is not organized around function but simply exists, claiming its own ground, he found that the ground was less solid than he had expected. He found himself, in the first years after leaving, doing things that he only recognized as self-diminishment in retrospect, minimizing his contributions in conversations, deferring to other people's assessments of situations where his own assessment was more informed, apologizing for the space he occupied in rooms, not literally, not in any way that was visible to the people around him, but internally, in the specific quality of his presence in any given situation, the quality of a person who has been trained to occupy the minimum necessary space and has internalized the training so completely that it operates even when the training environment is gone. He said the recognition of this pattern, the moment when he saw it clearly enough to name it, came approximately 18 months after he left the palace. He was in a meeting in his new professional context, and someone asked for his opinion on something within his area of expertise, and he heard himself begin to qualify the opinion before he had finished forming it. To hedge, to reduce, to present his informed, considered, expert view in a form that had been preemptively diminished, preemptively stripped of the confidence that the expertise warranted, preemptively adjusted for a standard of invisible, minimum necessary presence that this context did not require and had not asked for. He stopped mid-sentence. He started again. He said what he actually thought, in the voice that the expertise warranted, without the preemptive diminishment. He said it was one of the most difficult things he had done since leaving. He also said it was the beginning of something. Not recovery exactly. He was resistant to that word, resistant to the implication that what the service had done to him was an illness from which he was now convalescing, but a reorientation, a slow, effortful, ongoing process of reclaiming the ground that the institutional culture had trained him to vacate, of rebuilding the habit of legitimate self-assertion that the environment had systematically suppressed and that the world outside the environment not only permitted but expected. He said he was still working on it. He said he expected he always would be. The dimension of survival that appeared most consistently across the accounts of former staff, the one that seemed to cut across differences in role and length of service and individual personality and the specific nature of each person's experience inside the household, was the dimension of relationship, the reconstruction of the capacity for genuine human connection that the institutional culture had compressed and redirected, and in some cases very nearly eliminated, because this was the deepest cost, not the professional costs, which were real and in some cases significant, but which most people managed to recover from with sufficient time and sufficient distance from the institution, not the psychological costs, which were also real, and which required in many cases deliberate and sustained effort to address, but the relational costs, the specific damage done to the capacity for the kind of connection that requires mutual visibility, that requires both people in a relationship to be genuinely seen and to genuinely see, by years of existing in an environment where genuine mutual visibility was structurally impossible. You cannot learn to be truly seen by spending years inside a household organized around the principle that the people who serve are not fully visible. You cannot develop the muscles of genuine intimacy in an environment that treats intimacy as an institutional liability. You cannot emerge from long service in Elizabeth's household with your relational capacity fully intact, because the relational capacity requires exactly the things that the institutional culture systematically suppressed: the feeling without interrogation, the self-assertion without preemptive diminishment, the expectation of reciprocity, the belief that your presence in the world registers as significant to the people around you. These things had been compressed, in some people, compressed nearly to the point of extinction, and the work of reconstruction, of re-inflating the capacity for connection that the compression had flattened, was, by the account of everyone who undertook it, the longest and the hardest and the most necessary work of their post-palace lives. Some of them had help, partners who had waited, friends who had maintained the connection across the years of institutional distance and who were there, on the other side, when the person they had known before the service re-emerged, therapists who understood, or learned to understand, the specific nature of the environment that had produced the damage and who could help map the territory of the reconstruction. Some of them did it alone. The ones who did it alone took longer, but almost all of them did it. Almost all of them found their way, by whatever route the circumstances made available, back to something that was recognizably human, back to the capacity for feeling and self-assertion and genuine connection that the institution had compressed but had not, in most cases, entirely eliminated. They found their way back to themselves, imperfectly, incompletely, with the specific limitations that long service always leaves, the things that cannot be reconstructed, the losses that are too deep and too old to be fully recovered, the quiet spaces in their interior lives where something used to be and is no longer there, but back, undeniably, remarkably, stubbornly back. And that return, that specific, effortful, deeply human refusal to remain what the institution had made them, was perhaps the most important thing that the people who survived Elizabeth's household produced. Not the service, not the decades of composed, precise, institutionally flawless performance, but the return, the insistence on being, after everything, still themselves, still human, still here. History is not kind to complexity. It prefers the clean verdict, the settled judgment, the single, transmissible image that can be passed forward through time without the inconvenience of the contradictions that made the actual person irreducible to any single image. And so history will do what it has always done with Elizabeth. It will take the 70 years and the composure and the duty and the unbroken public service, and it will construct from those materials a monument, clean, permanent, stripped of the interior life that the monument cannot contain and does not know how to represent. The monument will be accurate as far as it goes. It will not go far enough, because the full truth of what she was, the complete, unedited, honestly accounted truth, requires holding two things simultaneously that the monument cannot hold. It requires holding the genuine greatness of the public performance alongside the genuine cost of the private reality. It requires understanding that the same qualities that made her extraordinary as a monarch made her, in the specific human spaces that the role could not reach, devastating to be close to. She was both. Completely, irreducibly, simultaneously both. The staff knew this. They knew it in the way that only people with decades of daily proximity can know another person. Not through the curated version, not through the managed presentation, but through the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary moments in which the real person, whatever the real person was, had no choice but to be visible. And what they knew, what the testimony assembled across this story has attempted to honestly convey, is that the woman at the center of the most powerful household in the world was also, in the ways that mattered most to the people around her, profoundly and permanently absent. Not cruel in the way that requires intention, not cold in the way that requires choice, but absent in the way that only a person who has been completely consumed by an institution can be absent, hollowed of the specific human availability that the people around her needed, not through malice, but through the long, thorough, irreversible process of becoming something that the institution required and that ordinary human warmth had no place inside. She gave everything to the role, and the role took everything. And the people who stood closest to her, who served her and needed her and hoped, across years and decades of proximity, that the warmth was coming, those people paid a portion of the price that the role extracted, paid it in the specific currency of the unseen and the unacknowledged and the perpetually deferred. They paid it without complaint, because the code required it, and most of them, Most of them, in the end, after the distance and the reckoning and the long work of reconstruction, would tell you that they do not regret the service, would tell you that proximity to something that enormous, however costly, is not nothing. That being inside history, even at the price that the inside demanded, is not a thing you can cleanly or simply wish away. But they would also tell you, if you asked the right question, in the right way, with sufficient patience to wait for the answer that lives below the official account, that it cost more than it should have, that the cost was not inevitable, that a different person, inside the same role, might have found a way to be both what the institution required and what the people around her needed, that the composure and the duty and the 70 years of unbroken service did not have to come at the price of every human being who stood close enough to feel the cold. That it was a choice, even if she never knew she was making it. That is what remains. Not the monument, not the ceremony, not the composed, unreadable, perfectly managed public face that the cameras captured 10,000 times and that history will carry forward as the definitive image of who she was. What remains is the testimony of the people she could not see. Still here, still speaking, still insisting, quietly and without malice, on being counted. Thanks for watching the full documentary. If you like this type of documentary, then please stay with us by subscribing to our channel.